On the dazzling New Year's Eve, when the entire city was counting down to welcome the new year, Noelle Paquette, a 27-year-old girl, stepped out of the party and walked home. No one knew those were her last steps. Noelle was a dedicated teacher, devoted to her family and community. But in minutes, she vanished. Her family frantically searched, while the police believed she simply needed time to calm down. However, strange things began to happen. A white car, two strangers, and a turn into the darkness. Only one witness saw Noelle get into the car before everything went silent. Everyone was shocked to learn that her disappearance led to one of the most heinous crimes in Canadian history, committed by a couple with a cruel fetish far beyond human imagination. When all the clues came together, the shocking truth was revealed. Noelle was not just lost. She was being hunted. Noelle Paquette was born on December 11, 1985. She was an active and friendly girl who easily connected with everyone, regardless of their age or social status. She was the second of 4 siblings in a close-knit family. Noelle attended high school in Sarnia, where she studied diligently and always knew what she wanted in life. Education and career were her top priorities. Although she wanted to start a family, she wanted to fulfill her dreams and become independent first. After graduating with excellent grades, she moved to Ottawa to pursue a bachelor's degree. Eventually, she found her true passion for teaching while in South Korea and enrolled in university to earn her teaching diploma. Everyone says that Noelle dearly loves her friends, and vice versa. However, her trustfulness sometimes led to difficulties. After obtaining her diploma, she began teaching at an elementary school and became a member of the student council within a few years. Despite her professional success, her personal life was challenging. Though she had romantic relationships and had a child, her first relationship ended, leaving her as a single mother. This change affected her daily life. Full-time work became difficult, so during her maternity leave, she became a teacher at a kindergarten near her home. When her child grew older, she was able to return to a normal life. Besides work, she also volunteered at an organization that helps people with disabilities and participated in a charity that supports children with serious illnesses. Despite her busy schedule, she still made time for soccer, the gym, and spending time with family and friends. By the end of 2012, Noelle was 27 years old. She dreamed of having a large family, continuing her career, and starting a relationship with a new boyfriend. On December 31st, she attended a party with friends. Unfortunately, the night started off poorly, as tensions arose between her and her boyfriend. After midnight, a conflict escalated, prompting Noelle to leave the party early. She is having difficulty finding a car to go home. At around 2:00 a.m., she left the party and said that she would walk home. Even though the distance takes about 20 minutes by car, her friends tried to persuade her to stay. But she didn't want to stay with her boyfriend and needed time to calm down. Unable to get a taxi, she decided to walk home. Despite their warnings, by 2:30 a.m., her boyfriend was worried. He had been trying to reach her since she left, initially thinking she would soon return, as she had done in the past during disagreements. When she didn't answer and her calls went to voicemail, he grew anxious and decided to check the route she might have taken, but found no sign of her. He then assumed she had likely gotten a ride with someone else and stopped searching, believing she just needed time alone. The next morning, Noelle's parents discovered that their daughter was missing. She had promised to come home after the party to spend time with her family and children the next day, but that didn't happen. They tried calling her cell phone multiple times, but there was no response. Growing worried, they first contacted Noelle's boyfriend, thinking she might have stayed over with him. He told them that she had left the party following a small argument and hadn't reached out to him since. Everyone, especially Noelle's mother, was very worried upon learning of the situation. On January 13, 2013, she called the police to report her daughter missing. Unfortunately, the officers were hesitant to take the case seriously, assuming Noelle had simply overindulged on New Year's Eve and would return home soon. Instead of searching for her, they went about their daily routines. While her family and friends decided to organize their own search, they contacted everyone who had attended the party. But no one had seen Noelle since she left. Her phone still went unanswered. After pressure from her family, the police finally began searching for Noelle. The investigation deepened, and the situation became increasingly serious as there were no signs of her being active, no access to social media, and no use of credit cards. Significantly, she hadn't contacted her family or her child, which was completely out of character for her. To shape their investigation, detectives started interviewing others who were at the party, particularly Noelle's boyfriend. Given their argument that night, he stated that he had left to look for Noelle but did not return. Others at the party corroborated this. He asserted that after unsuccessful searching, he simply returned home. But no one could confirm his story, making his alibi questionable. While he cooperated with law enforcement, describing his relationship with Noelle as serious and generally stable, he admitted that their disagreements could escalate. The police found no evidence against him and no prior criminal record, making him appear innocent. Everyone depicted him as calm and composed, incapable of violence. Even those at the party saw their disagreement as minor, with no physical confrontation occurring. As detectives pursued new leads, Noelle's family continued their own investigation. They made flyers with her picture and reached out to local residents. The mother and her youngest daughter showed Noelle's photo to people they encountered on the street. One man recognized her. He had been returning from a bar that night and noticed Noelle walking alone along a deserted road. He described her as being far behind him, but catching his eye, he saw a car pull up next to her. And after a brief exchange, she got in. What followed raised suspicions. Another man, previously unnoted, ran toward the white car. Instead of driving away, the car backed up and the stranger jumped into the back seat. The car then sped off quickly, squealing its tires. Initially, the witness didn't think much of it, but later he regretted not reporting it to the police. When Noelle's mother relayed this account at the police station, detectives became interested and decided to interview the witness personally. His account seemed plausible, especially after they reviewed CCTV footage from the area. Noelle was seen walking down the street, but then disappeared from the camera's view. The footage captured a white Pontiac, which a witness identified as the vehicle that had picked up both Noelle and a strange man. Unfortunately, the car soon left the city and moved toward the interurban highway, causing it to go out of sight. However, this information revealed a troubling coincidence. Around 4 a.m., on New Year's Eve, a highway patrol officer noticed the same white Pontiac about 30 kilometers from Sarnia. The car was stopped on the side of the road with its hazard lights on, smoke rising from the hood, and both the driver and passenger attempting to extinguish a fire. A police officer, thinking they needed help, approached. A 19-year-old man was outside looking at the engine, while a 31-year-old woman was inside. The headlights illuminated their hands, faces, and clothes, which were covered in odd stains that looked like blood. They appeared to have been in some kind of accident and needed assistance. The woman got out and admitted to the police officer that her hands were covered in blood, but didn't specify the cause. The car belonged to Tanya Bogdanovich, and the young man with her introduced himself as Michael McGregor. Tanya explained that she and Michael had gone into the woods for privacy. They enjoyed extreme forms of intimacy, including tying each other up and using knives. After examining them, the police observed that they had several stab wounds, scratches, and abrasions, but none appeared to be life-threatening. Tanya insisted that their injuries were caused by the use of sharp objects during intimacy, claiming they accidentally hurt each other. Although this explained the blood, it did not sound very convincing. Michael supported her story, but neither could satisfactorily explain why they chose to engage in such intimate activities in a secluded forest at night. Although their car was inoperable, they insisted they didn't need help. However, the officers prioritized their own safety and called for emergency assistance. Tanya and Michael were taken to a medical center, leaving their car behind for later towing. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics noticed their strange behavior. In spite of the circumstances, they behaved casually, laughing, hugging, and kissing as though nothing was wrong. While paramedics treated their wounds, police officers looked into their backgrounds. Michael is a pizza delivery man, while Tanya is a nurse with 3 children, working at a nursing home. Finding nothing unusual, the police left the clinic, leaving them alone. However, considering an eyewitness account of Noelle's abduction by a strange couple, the situation seemed increasingly suspicious. Patrol officers reported that Tanya and Michael looked quite frightening, similar to characters in a horror movie, even though they always appeared cheerful and refused any help. This raised red flags about their true intentions. Detectives sought to investigate further and discovered that Michael and Tanya were not married, but merely dating. It turned out that they had met 7 months earlier on a community website, where they quickly connected and started sharing their unique fantasies. Initially, they communicated through messages and later included other community members. Soon after meeting in person, their role-playing became more explicit and disturbing, but they were still not satisfied. Ultimately, they decided to fulfill their darkest fantasies. On January 2, while the investigation was ongoing, a new witness contacted law enforcement to inform them of a woman's body he had discovered. The body was located in a remote wooded area outside of Sarnia, approximately 30 kilometers away. When the police arrived, they quickly recognized that the woman had been violently and brutally murdered. The victim had been mutilated and left in the snow, showing clear signs of a struggle. Her hands, face, and upper body had wounds consistent with self-defense, and there were numerous marks indicating torture. Official identification confirmed that the victim was 27-year-old Noelle Paquette. Most of her injuries seemed to have been caused by a bladed weapon, likely a small knife. A forensic expert identified marks from 2 different knives, suggesting the involvement of 2 assailants. In addition, Noelle was also subjected to abuse. The absence of snow during the New Year's holiday made it easier to gather evidence. Many footprints were found near her body and traced back to a white Pontiac vehicle. A couple, Tanya and Michael, were discovered in that same car with their hazard lights on, close to the forest where the body was found. Police suspected them of being involved in the murder, so they collected their clothes and personal items for forensic analysis. Although Tanya and Michael were initially released, the police later issued arrest warrants just 2 days after Noelle's body was found. Tanya, a mother of 3, was arrested in a hospital parking lot while accompanying Michael, who was there to get stitches for injuries he sustained during the attack. He allegedly cut himself. Upon his release, he was also taken into custody. With the suspects now apprehended, detectives began piecing together the events of that New Year's Eve, a task that proved more challenging than anticipated. They utilized electronic evidence, including texts, emails, social media posts, and private messages exchanged between Tanya and Michael, to help solve the case. During the interrogations, Tanya and Michael consistently denied any involvement in the murder of Noelle. However, as they spoke, detectives uncovered numerous inconsistencies in their statements. They initially described their relationship in vague terms, referring to themselves as playmates or best friends. Despite a 12-year age gap and differing lifestyles, sometimes they compared themselves to wild animals, revealing glimpses of their unusual tendencies. Their exchanges quickly shifted from a flirtatious relationship to discussions of crime and cruel games. Both Tanya and Michael shared morbid fantasies about intimacy in the woods, abuse, dominance, and murder. Their communications revealed that their first intimate encounter occurred in June 2012 at the same forest where Noelle was killed. In their role-playing, it was alleged that Michael abused Tanya, which she later described as empowering. Michael responded by claiming that she had awakened his sadistic side, enjoying the humiliation and fear he inflicted upon her. In her view, these encounters were preparation for something more serious. Their encounters for intimate activities became more frequent, including public meetings. They documented these events in a blog under pseudonyms, taking names from cartoon characters. Their blog posts detailed scenes of bondage, role-playing, and taboo interactions, such as leading each other around malls on leashes and in handcuffs. Over time, their violent fantasies grew more extreme, indicating an insatiable desire. By September 2012, they began discussing the need for a third person to join their games, quickly realizing that they wanted a real victim to torture, abuse, and murder. After finalizing her plan, Tanya began to act. She went to a hardware store and bought 2 knives, a fact confirmed during the investigation. These knives later became the murder weapons. Shortly after buying the knives, Tanya gifted Michael a digital photo frame filled with images of young girls, all sharing a common trait: they were young and innocent, similar to the type her boyfriend preferred. Included in these images was a girl Tanya knew personally. They then began searching for a victim. But Noelle wasn't on their list. They spent nearly 3 months preparing for their crime, and by New Year's Eve, they were ready to commit acts of abuse and murder. However, the girl Michael had chosen wasn't there. Her plan changed at the last minute, and she left town for the holidays. This saved her life, but made Noelle a target. Tanya and Michael refused to abandon their violent intentions. The day before the planned murder, Tanya informed Michael that they would need to select a victim at random. This forced them to change their plan. They decided to find any young woman on the street and set up an elaborate trap. Tanya would drive with Michael, both observing and searching for a suitable victim. When they spotted a target, Michael would get out of the car and watch her from a distance. Tanya would approach the woman herself and lure her into the car. Then she would pick up Michael. While in the back seat, Michael would use a knife to threaten the victim. Their plan unfolded flawlessly. A background check revealed they didn't know Noelle. Unfortunately, she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. While Noelle enjoyed a party with friends and her boyfriend, Tanya, who worked at a nursing home, spent her days and evenings texting Michael, assuring him that their plan would succeed on New Year's Eve. Additionally, finding taxis or transportation on New Year's Eve was a challenge, as many would be seeking rides. Tanya finished her shift at 11:00 p.m. and met Michael on the city embankment to celebrate New Year's. They lit some fireworks, discussed their plan, and began their hunt. True to their expectations, Tanya took the wheel, believing that a woman driving would appear more trustworthy than a stranger trying to help. This tactic proved effective when Tanya approached Noelle, who gratefully accepted the offer of a ride home. Once Noelle was inside, Tanya reversed the car, and Michael entered the backseat to execute their plan. Michael quickly brandished a knife, putting it against Noelle's throat and threatening her life. As Noelle complied without resistance, they drove her on quiet, dark roads 30 kilometers outside the city to a remote forest. They intended to drive further, but their white car unexpectedly broke down near the woods. Unbothered by the situation, Tanya and Michael forced Noelle out of the car, dragged her into the woods, and subjected her to abuse, torture, and, ultimately, murder. An autopsy revealed she suffered countless stab wounds, damaging her heart, lungs, liver, and other critical organs. However, the fatal injury was a deep cut to her throat. Her body was left in the woods, stripped of her clothes and personal belongings. Tanya and Michael tried to escape but were unsuccessful because their car broke down. Fortunately, they attracted the attention of patrol officers. Otherwise, finding them would have been very difficult. The investigation lasted nearly 3 years, aiming to reconstruct the sequence of events. During this time, a great deal of evidence was gathered against Tanya and Michael, including digital data and expert analysis results from the white Pontiac. By the end of 2015, all the details surrounding Noelle's horrific death had been clarified, and a preliminary hearing was scheduled for December. Tanya and Michael had initially denied their involvement in the crime. However, surprisingly, just before the trial began, they pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, choosing to forego a trial. This decision was likely influenced by the overwhelming evidence against them, as a confession might have been their only chance to lessen the severity of their sentences. Noelle's relatives believe that Tanya and Michael avoided revealing gruesome details of the murder to avoid public outrage, hoping to receive a lighter sentence. In 2016, both Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, the maximum penalty under Canadian law. The judge made it clear that they had committed one of the most brutal crimes in Canadian history. In addition to life imprisonment, Tanya and Michael were placed in a DNA database, added to the National Abuser List, and banned from owning firearms for life. They were also forbidden from contacting Noelle's family and friends. Shortly after, Tanya, 34, and Michael, 22, expressed apologies to Noelle's parents, but many found their apologies insincere. Although Canadian law didn't allow for a harsher sentence, some still felt the sentences were too lenient. Relatives of Noelle expressed their concerns, with her mother revealing that she had suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and depression following her daughter's death. She was haunted by nightmares and unable to return to work even 3 years later. One peaceful afternoon in Florida, a 13-year-old girl walked into her home to find her 4 younger siblings screaming, crawling around in red stains on the floor. Small, bloody footprints all over the kitchen. There was no sign of forced entry, no goodbyes, just 5 children, left alone beside their mother's body, and the killer who had vanished as if he had never existed. To understand why a mother became the target of such a vicious plan, we must go back many years to where the tragedy really began. Sheila Lee Walsh, born in Topeka, Kansas on October 19, 1962, met her first husband, Alan Blackthorne, shortly after finishing high school. Sheila was small, kind, and quiet. She had a difficult childhood. Her father, an Air Force pilot, was often away, and he died in Laos when she was only 10 years old. She longed for stability, for love, and for a family she could build with her own hands. After college, Sheila found work as an office administrator at a local law firm. That was where she met the charming, confident Alan, a man who quickly swept the inexperienced young woman off her feet. On their 3rd date, he proposed. Within 3 months, they married. Born in June 1955, Alan was 7 years older and, at least on the surface, far more worldly. But Alan's past held shadows Sheila never saw. Long before adulthood, he showed concerning behavior, cruelty toward animals, obsessive attitudes toward girls, even an accusation of attempted abuse while in high school. He had several minor criminal charges, but thanks to a string of lenient judges and expunged records, the man standing before Sheila looked clean, respectable, harmless. Alan easily gained the trust of Sheila's family. Even after the wedding, none of them suspected what was coming. Soon, He convinced them to invest a large sum into his electronics business, claiming he was preparing to expand. They had no idea the business was already failing. By the time the truth surfaced, Alan had declared bankruptcy and whisked his young, pregnant wife off to Hawaii, far from home, dependent and expecting a baby. Sheila found herself cornered, torn between her loyalty to her parents and the father of her unborn child. She still hasn't realized the cruelty of the man she has been with all her life. Years later, much would be revealed. Alan had been married before. His first wife, Eileen, endured extreme physical and psychological abuse, choking, beatings, even being kicked in the stomach while pregnant. Immediately after childbirth, Alan insisted they give the baby up for adoption because he wasn't ready to be a father. His violence extended beyond people. When their dog had an accident on the carpet, Alan beat the animal to death. Not only that, at one point, he forced situations where Eileen's younger brothers would witness intimate moments, and he often pressured her into degrading scenarios for his satisfaction. He also had a habit of dressing in women's lingerie before asking to be driven to rough neighborhoods, where he would wander home alone, a dangerous thrill he craved. Eileen and her husband had a bad marriage that lasted 5 years. During that time, she became pregnant again. Frightened, she decided to have an abortion and secretly began making plans to leave him. His second wife, Mary, initially believed she had met a loving, attentive father figure, but the facade shattered quickly. Alan used her 2 young children to manipulate and control her, threatening violence if she ever tried to leave. After 3 years of escalating intimidation, she fled with her children in the middle of the night, fortunate to escape the prolonged torment Eileen endured. Then came Sheila. When Alan met her, he saw vulnerability and opportunity. They married in 1982. Until that moment, Sheila had no way of knowing about his abusive past or hidden obsessions. At first, he was everything she thought she needed: loving, attentive, protective. But the mask slipped. Slowly, affection turned into criticism, criticism into anger, and anger into daily emotional warfare. Sheila was young, inexperienced, conditioned to believe that any outburst from the man she loved must somehow be her fault. And Alan, skilled in manipulation, took full advantage of that. The turning point came 6 months into the marriage, when Alan, with Sheila in the passenger seat, was involved in a collision with a motorcyclist. The rider died at the scene, and Alan immediately fled, terrified that witnesses had seen him. He phoned his father, who urged him to file a false report claiming he had been attacked by an aggressive stranger and had driven off only to protect his pregnant wife. Alan was eventually charged with fleeing the scene of a fatal accident and failing to render aid. But the case ended in a hung jury, and the district attorney declined to retry him. In the end, Alan walked away without consequences, despite being responsible for the man's death. After the couple relocated, Alan resumed his attempts to revive his business ambitions. During that time, Sheila's sister visited and was alarmed by her appearance. Sheila was pregnant, but she looked shockingly frail, like the starving children often shown in charity campaigns of the 1,980 seconds. Sheila later admitted to her parents how grim things had become. Yet, despite everything, she had no intention of leaving her husband. Financial dependence kept her trapped. Alan was launching a new business selling electrical muscle stimulators. To secure support, he persuaded relatives to move with them to Honolulu. But in July 1985, the enterprise collapsed. Alan continued advertising the devices, but authorities arrested him and seized his inventory because he lacked the required permits and the machines failed certification. The incident erupted into a public scandal. After the business failed, Alan took Sheila back to California. There, Sheila confided more openly in her sister about what life in Honolulu had been like. Alan frequently insulted her, accused her of affairs, flaunted his own infidelities. He would bring other women into their home and have loud, intimate encounters within earshot of his wife and daughters. Sheila endured it all because she felt financially paralyzed. She had no savings, no support system, and had been isolated from her family. Back in the mainland United States, Alan again managed to attract investors for another business venture, once more involving muscle stimulation devices, this time medically approved. It was during this period that his cruelty escalated. Sheila's sister noticed that Sheila looked older, exhausted, and physically unwell. But alongside this decline came a flicker of resolve. For the first time, Sheila expressed a desire to leave him. A notion sparked after Alan tried to drown her by forcing her head into a toilet and flushing repeatedly. In September 1987, another attack occurred. Alan beat her with a belt before bed, then struck her repeatedly with his fists. Finally, Sheila called the police. Police arrested Alan, but the consequences were minimal, a fine rather than jail time. Sheila seized the chance to flee. She gathered her daughters and ran to the home of Janda, the family's former nanny. Unfortunately, Alan anticipated her escape and intercepted her there. While Janda hurried the children inside, Alan began beating Sheila. A neighbor witnessed the assault and rushed over, managing to drive Alan off. Furious, Alan climbed into Sheila's car, ran over the neighbor, smashed through a gate, then escaped in his own vehicle. He was arrested a few hours later. Miraculously, the neighbor survived with minor injuries. Alan received a $425 fine and 18 months of probation. Following Alan's arrest, Sheila fled with her daughters to Oregon to stay with her sister Carrie. She hid there for several weeks before realizing she could not live indefinitely in secrecy. She needed to face the legal process if she hoped to protect her children permanently. In October 1987, she wrote a detailed, 100-page account documenting years of Alan's abuse. By September 1988, the divorce was finalized in Sheila's favor. She received custody of their daughters, a vehicle, and $1,250 a month in child support. Later, Alan persuaded her to move to San Antonio, promising to buy her a home so she could live closer to the girls. Sheila eventually agreed, a decision she soon realized was a devastating mistake. Once she moved, Alan immediately began manipulating the children against their mother, and child support payments were routinely delayed. Sheila knew Alan had the financial means to pay. He simply chose not to. She had to take him to court for nearly every payment. Alan, obsessed with retaliation, studied family law constantly, searching for loopholes to use against her. He eventually succeeded in reducing the child support amount to $350 in a hearing Sheila hadn't even been notified of. That reduction forced her into further litigation. After additional hearings, the original support amount was reinstated, but each payment remained a battle, a deliberate torment Alan never stopped inflicting. Frustrated and desperate to receive compensation for the years of abuse she had endured, Sheila went back to court demanding her share of Alan's assets. But Alan was exceptionally skilled at hiding his money. Instead of the roughly $250,000 she was entitled to, Sheila received only about $22,000. Despite everything she had suffered, Sheila was determined to rebuild her life and create stability for her children. In August 1992, she met a gentle, soft-spoken man named Jamie Belush. Their relationship blossomed quickly. The two were married in June 1993. Jamie was a devout Christian, a former Marine, and an employee at a pharmaceutical company. Life finally seemed to be turning in Sheila's favor, but Alan was far from finished. He continued to look for new ways to torment his ex-wife. The day before Sheila and Jamie's wedding rehearsal dinner, Alan picked up the girls for a routine visit. Instead of returning them, he sent a bailiff to serve Sheila with yet another lawsuit, this time demanding expanded custody. Sheila and Jamie married the next day, but their honeymoon was overshadowed by the legal hearing that followed. As the girls grew older, around 8 or 9, Sheila began hearing troubling things from them. Her daughter, Stevie, eventually confided that Alan had touched her inappropriately. Sheila used this revelation as leverage. When Alan attempted to file another custody-related lawsuit, she informed him she was prepared to report him for molesting their daughter. Stevie's statement was formally recorded, but Sheila refused to make her daughter face the trauma again in court. The threat alone was enough. Alan backed down. From then on, all communication between them went strictly through attorneys. The children no longer wished to visit Alan, and meanwhile, Sheila began building a new life with Jamie. He wanted children of his own, but Sheila struggled to conceive. They turned to IVF, and in December 1995, Sheila gave birth to quadruplets, 3 boys and 1 girl. For a moment, the chaos of the past seemed finally behind her, yet danger continued to haunt her. When Sheila was 7 months pregnant, her sister Carrie came to visit. Just days earlier, the O.J. Simpson verdict had been announced. Hearing that Simpson had been acquitted of murdering his ex-wife terrified Sheila. She told Carrie she feared that if Simpson could get away with it, then Alan, who had spent years threatening, stalking, and tormenting her, might convince himself he could kill her too. Carrie tried to reassure her, but Sheila remained shaken. She even asked her sister to care for her children if anything ever happened to her, and to contact a woman named Enrule to share what she feared. By June 1997, Alan had filed yet another lawsuit, angry that Stevie had stopped visiting him. Sheila was prepared. She warned him plainly that if he pursued the case, she would report his inappropriate behavior toward their daughter. Realizing she was serious, Alan abruptly withdrew the lawsuit. Shortly afterward, he announced he wanted to terminate his parental rights altogether. Even so, he continued to stalk Sheila from a distance, and she believed he never stopped plotting revenge. Alan manipulated a neighbor into spying on her, convincing the woman that Sheila's children were being mistreated. The neighbor even installed enormous floodlights that shone directly into the Bellish family's bedroom every night. Sheila and Jamie complained repeatedly, but law enforcement did nothing. Eventually, the constant harassment drove them to make plans to move. One afternoon, while the nanny was watching the children, Sheila and Jamie returned home to discover that Daryl, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, had visited her father. Despite losing all parental rights, Alan had still managed to see her. Sheila panicked, terrified he would discover where they were planning to relocate. In a moment of anger and fear, Sheila struck Daryl once with a belt. With Alan's encouragement, Daryl filed a domestic violence complaint, and because Alan no longer had legal rights to her, Daryl was immediately placed into protective custody while an investigation began. The court eventually found no evidence that Sheila or Jamie had abused or coerced their children. The family then quietly moved to Sarasota, Florida at night. But even there, peace was short-lived. A neighbor from Texas eventually revealed their new address to Alan. Daryl, still in state custody during the ongoing proceedings, remained a constant source of anxiety for Sheila and Jamie, who feared she might unintentionally disclose their location. The Bellishes were so cautious that even their closest friends back in San Antonio were told nothing more than a post office box number. During this period, Sheila's anxiety reached its peak. Even though she had been divorced from Alan for nearly 10 years, the fear that he might someday kill her never left her. And tragically, her fear wasn't irrational. Behind the scenes, Alan Blackthorne was actively trying to track her down. He first hired a private investigator to locate her. When that didn't work, he pressured the man into surveilling every Baptist church in the region, hoping to spot Sheila among the congregations. The task was unrealistic. There were simply too many churches, and the investigator eventually abandoned the effort. Alan then returned to the one vulnerable link he still had access to: Daryl, his daughter, who was in the custody of Child Protective Services due to ongoing court proceedings. Daryl was emotionally fragile and deeply conflicted. Yet for months she managed not to reveal the Bellish family's new address, partly because she genuinely did not know it herself. But over time, Alan coaxed bits and pieces from her, small clues that slowly painted a picture, and once he had extracted the information he needed, he abruptly cut contact with her, ignoring her calls completely. Next, Alan used a ruse. He hired a man to deliver flowers to the general area Daryl had described. The delivery man went door to door at several houses, asking for Sheila. At one home, Jamie Bellush opened the door and casually accepted the bouquet, unknowingly confirming the correct address. The deliver flowers called Alan back with the details, unaware he had just become part of something far darker than a flower delivery. 13-year-old Stevie Bellish had never had a peaceful life, but everything reached its breaking point on the afternoon of November 7, 1997. She came home from school excited, ready to tell her mother she had been invited on her very first date. But the moment she reached the front steps, something felt wrong. The door was unlocked. Something Sheila never allowed. Inside, Stevie found her 4 younger siblings behaving strangely, screaming in a way she had never heard before. The children, all toddlers, were naked except for life jackets. It looked as if Sheila had been preparing to bathe them in the pool, a normal routine. But something had interrupted her. Stevie walked through the house calling for her mother, but heard nothing. She noticed what looked like red paint streaking her siblings' skin. But at 13, she still didn't fully grasp what she was seeing. Then she entered the living room and saw belongings scattered everywhere, signs of a violent struggle. In the kitchen, she saw clothes on the floor soaked in red. When she lifted them, her world broke open. Her mother, Sheila, lay beneath the pile. Stevie dialed 911, her voice shaking, and told the dispatcher that her 35-year-old mother was dead and that her throat had been cut. The dispatcher stayed on the line until the first officer arrived. The officer walked Stevie outside, where all 4 toddlers clung to her legs, covered in blood. When asked who could have done this, she answered instantly. She knew only one person who had ever wanted her mother dead: her biological father, Alan Blackthorne. Police soon learned that Sheila owned 20% of Alan's profitable medical equipment business, and that Alan owed her $7 million in court-ordered payments, money he had no intention of giving her. The financial motive was overwhelming, but investigators hit their first roadblock. Alan had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the murder, he was at a golf course in Texas. The medical examiner determined that Sheila had been dead for about 2 hours when Stevie found her. The killer first shot her in the face with a .45 caliber handgun. Little Tim, one of the quadruplets, was believed to have been clinging to her when she was attacked. The bullet entered her cheek, exited the back of her head, and sent her crashing to her knees so hard that bruises formed instantly. But she didn't die right away. Sheila somehow stood back up and staggered toward the wall phone. In the kitchen, bleeding heavily, she managed to dial 911, but never spoke, because the killer grabbed a butcher knife from its stand and slashed her throat repeatedly. Even then, Sheila fought. She had multiple defensive wounds, including one deep enough to expose the bone in her arm. The major veins on both sides of her neck were severed. Despite the severity of the wounds, the medical examiner concluded she could have survived if help had reached her in time. Instead, she collapsed on the kitchen floor while her 4 toddlers crawled through her blood, crying and screaming for a mother who could no longer respond. A single fingerprint was found in the dried blood, but it didn't match Alan's or anyone in the household. A broken, blood-stained knife lay next to her body. The crime was brutal. The scene was chaotic, and the killer had vanished. While questioning neighbors, police located the owner of a landscaping company mowing a yard near the Bellush home. The landscaper told officers he had seen a white car he didn't recognize pull up to the house earlier that morning. Inside sat a large, intimidating-looking man. Frightened, the landscaper tried not to stare, but he memorized the license plate. When officers ran the tag, it traced back to a woman in Texas, the grandmother of 21-year-old José Del Toro. When detectives questioned Alan Blackthorne, he behaved coolly, even giving interviews to the media. He insisted he had only hit Sheila once in their marriage and called it the worst mistake of his life. As expected, he denied killing her and attempted to blame Daniel Alex Rocha, a friend who owned the golf course he frequented. However, his story quickly unraveled. When police reached Daniel, he revealed something far more disturbing. Alan had hired 27-year-old Samuel Gonzalez, first paying him $9,000. Soon after, Gonzalez brought in his 21-year-old cousin, José Del Toro, because Alan didn't want to get his own hands dirty. José, once a popular high school football star and prom queen's boyfriend, had long since fallen from grace. By 21, he was deep into banned substances and desperate for money. He had a few minor legal problems in the past, but he wasn't known to be violent. That changed when Blackthorne paid him to kill a woman, claiming she was abusing her children. Alan provided José with an old photograph of Sheila holding their daughter, taken during their marriage. Investigators later found this photo among José's belongings, but Blackthorne made a critical mistake. He hired a pair of unusually incompetent hitmen. José used his real identification to check into a motel near the Bellish home. Surveillance footage captured him buying camouflage clothing. During interrogation, he crumbled quickly. José admitted sneaking into the garage and watching Sheila with her children, noting she seemed like a loving mother. Completely unlike the monster Alan had described, he claimed he almost backed out. But Alan pressured him relentlessly, insisting Sheila was dangerous, had to be dealt with. Even so, parts of José's story conflicted with evidence, making investigators doubt his version of events. Samuel Gonzalez, who introduced Alan to his cousin, José Luis Del Toro, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in June 1998 and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Daniel Alex Rocha, 29, acted as the middleman connecting Alan with Samuel Gonzalez, was convicted in January 1999 of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole in February 1999. By the time authorities finally located José Del Toro, he had already fled to Mexico. With financial help from Rocha, he fought extradition for more than a year. José Del Toro was extradited to the United States in July 1999, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and armed burglary in 2000 in Florida. Judge Paul Logan sentenced José to 2 consecutive life terms, the maximum sentence for both charges. At sentencing, he cried and asked Jamie Bellish for forgiveness, vowing to expose everyone involved in Sheila's murder. There's one more important step left, and that's taking down the man who masterminded the entire affair, Alan Blackthorne. With relentless support from Sheila's sister and a team of attorneys, investigators spent 2 full years building the case. Witness after witness came forward describing Alan's long history of abuse toward Sheila and his previous wives. Searches uncovered alarming evidence. Alan and his new wife, Maureen, had been planning Sheila's murder for months. In their garage, investigators found a wall covered with photographs, notes, and a step-by-step plan. Shockingly, the couple seemed so confident in their impunity that they never bothered to remove any of it. During the investigation, Alan transferred nearly $50 million in assets into Maureen's accounts. Jamie Bellish filed 2 civil suits against them, totaling $38 million, and pursued legal action against others involved in the conspiracy. On January 4, 2000, 44-year-old Alan Blackthorne was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and several related offenses. Because he was considered a flight risk, bail was denied. At trial, his daughters Stevie and Daryl testified against him. Alan never once looked at them, showing no emotion, no acknowledgement, nothing. Prosecutors presented nearly 40 pieces of evidence proving a calculated plot to kill Sheila. After closing arguments, The jury deliberated only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts, Alan Blackthorne was convicted of federal charges of conspiracy to commit interstate murder and interstate domestic violence. He received 2 concurrent life sentences without parole. Beginning at the Beaumont, Texas, federal prison, following his conviction, Alan Blackthorne was transferred to federal prison, where he quickly became a target. Inmates attacked him several times, once stabbing him repeatedly, and in another assault, driving a sharpened screwdriver into his eye. Despite the brutality of these attacks, Alan survived. On November 18, 2014, at the age of 59, he died in federal custody in Terre Haute, Indiana. The official cause of death was never released, even within his own family. Reactions were cold and distant. His wife, Maureen Blackthorne, who had been convicted on financial charges in 2004, filed for divorce the following year. Meanwhile, Jamie Bellush took custody of the quadruplets as well as Stevie, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, but forgiveness did not come easily. Jamie struggled deeply with resentment toward Daryl, who had once confronted Sheila with allegations of abuse and unwittingly revealed clues about the family's location, information Alan Blackthorne later exploited. Although Daryl had been manipulated as a child and never intended harm, Jamie found it difficult to separate her innocence from the catastrophic consequences that followed. In 2001, after years of legal battles, Alan's remaining assets, roughly $5 million, were finally unfrozen and distributed among Sheila's children. It offered financial security but could never replace what they had lost. In the months before her death, Sheila had confided in her sister, asking her to contact writer Ann Rule if the worst ever happened. Honoring that request, her sister reached out. Rule later included Sheila's case in her work, ensuring that her story and the brutality she endured would never be forgotten. That night in Thousand Oaks began like any other. Quiet, without a hint of anything unusual. But just hours later, a young man would die in his own apartment, stabbed 108 times by the woman he trusted completely. This isn't just a story about a seemingly harmless date or a simple marijuana try. It's a series of small, unconscious choices leading to an irreversible tragedy, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurs hauntingly. So what exactly happened behind those apartment doors? Was it a marijuana-induced psychosis? A silent, coerced act? Or a tragedy the legal system was never prepared to confront? The answer will force us to reconsider the hardest questions about justice, about accountability, and about the true cost of a seemingly harmless decision. Chad O'Melia was born on September 27, 1991, in Santa Clarita, a city north of Los Angeles, California. His father, Sean O'Melia, was an Irish construction supervisor. His mother, Michelle, separated from his father when he was 5 years old. Despite the separation, his parents showed him great love and tried to provide him with a stable family. Chad is known for being intelligent, responsible, and loyal. To his friends, he was the dependable big brother, always ready to help or offer advice without expecting anything in return. From a young age, Chad developed a love for American football, a passion he kept throughout his teenage years. While attending Chico State University, Chad continued playing American football while studying accounting, and later graduated. After graduating, he moved to Thousand Oaks, Los Angeles, with his dog, Athena. He shared the apartment with a roommate, Vinny Oliveira, while working at an accounting firm. He was working toward becoming a certified public accountant (CPA), which left him with little time for rest. To cope with his sleepless nights, he began using cannabis to help him relax and fall asleep. According to Vinny, Chad often showed signs of being high when he was at home. His cannabis use wasn't a secret. His friends and parents both knew. Although his parents didn't approve, they considered it a relatively harmless habit compared to other risks young adults faced. Sean, Chad's father, shared that his son always respected him and never used marijuana in front of him because he knew he hated it. Sean viewed marijuana as a bad habit that negatively impacted his son's mind and will. However, he never imagined that this would be the beginning of tragedies that would change everything. It was this habit that would eventually bring Chad into contact with a woman who would lead him into a devastating nightmare. Bryn was born on January 25, 1991, in Chicago, Illinois. Her early life was filled with challenges. She experienced serious health issues that required multiple surgeries and heavy medications, which affected both her body and her mind from a young age. These medical treatments took a severe toll on her hearing. By age 4, she needed cochlear implants to improve her hearing and help her learn to read lips. Growing up, Bryn often felt isolated and different. In school, she was usually the only student with hearing loss and sometimes hid her hearing aids to avoid teasing. As she grew older, Bryn turned what once made her feel ashamed into a source of strength. She went on to pursue a doctorate in biology at the University of Washington School of Medicine and graduated in the 2010 seconds with distinction. One of her professors later described her as one of the most exceptional students he had ever taught. In August 2017, at age 26, Bryn moved to Thousand Oaks to work as a biologist for UCLA Health, which is connected to the David Geffen School of Medicine. At first, she rented an apartment that didn't allow pets, so she had to leave her beloved Siberian Husky, Arya, with her family in Illinois. In April 2018, Bryn found a new pet-friendly apartment and was joyfully reunited with Arya. 2 years earlier, she had trained Arya to be a service animal, and having her dog back gave her renewed happiness and balance. The pair were often seen walking through Conejo Creek Park in Thousand Oaks, one of Bryn's favorite places to unwind. It was at that same park where Bryn first met Chad in late April 2018. According to her, Chad was the one who approached her several times when their paths crossed. Finally, he asked for her phone number, but she refused. Still, Chad gave her his business card and told her to reach out if she ever wanted to hang out. Not long after, Bryn initiated contact with Chad, and their chance encounters quickly developed into a romantic relationship. They shared meals, spent time with friends, and once enjoyed a bottle of Irish whiskey together while watching their dogs play at the park. Bryn was drawn to Chad's humor, yet warmth and thoughtfulness. Although she initially doubted their compatibility, she soon realized they complemented each other perfectly, like two pieces of a puzzle. On Sunday, May 27, 2018, the day before Memorial Day, Bryn spent the evening drinking with friends. Later that night, Chad contacted her and invited her over. Around 10:30 p.m., 27-year-old Bryn arrived at Chad's apartment with her dog, Arya. The two relaxed, had a few drinks, and chatted with Chad's roommate, Vinny. Shortly after midnight, Chad took out his water pipe, packed it with cannabis, and stepped onto the balcony to smoke. Bryn soon joined him and asked to try it. As soon as she inhaled, her throat burned, and she began coughing. She mentioned that she had never enjoyed cannabis and never felt its effects like others did. Curious, Chad packed the pipe again with even more cannabis and encouraged her to try once more so she could finally experience a high. Bryn agreed and took another hit. What happened next was terrifying and surreal. In the early hours of May 28, Thousand Oaks police received a frantic 911 call from Vinny, reporting that something terrible was happening in the apartment. When officers arrived, their body cameras captured a horrific scene. Bryn violently attacked Chad, stabbing him multiple times with kitchen utensils before self-harming. Police attempted to subdue her using a taser 4 times, but she did not react. Officers then used their batons, striking her 9 times until she finally released the weapon. Bryn suffered 5 fractures in one arm and deep cuts to her neck, base, and right hand. She had also attacked her dog, Heiress, but the animal miraculously survived. Chad, however, did not. When police reached him, he was already dead, having been stabbed 108 times. Bryn was rushed to the emergency room and underwent emergency surgery, which saved her life. She was later admitted for further recovery. Once she regained consciousness, investigators began questioning her. Still intubated and unable to speak, she wrote her responses, claiming she had told Chad she didn't want to smoke anymore, but that he had forced her to. Investigators suspected she had no memory of what had happened, a fact they confirmed with her a few days later. When Bryn's health stabilized, she was arrested and charged with murder. The tragedy devastated both families. Chad's father, Sean, had the heartbreaking duty of telling his ex-wife, Michelle, about their son's death. He explained that he wanted to tell Michelle himself to be there for her in that shattering moment. Sean remembered seeing the light fade from her eyes as she realized their son was gone. From then on, Michelle fell into a deep depression. Sean later reflected that losing a child leaves a crushing guilt, a sense that happiness may never return. Michelle experienced exactly that, her grief compounded by her struggle with type 2 diabetes. After the funeral, Michelle felt undeserving of happiness. She refused to smile for photos or let anyone capture her appearing calm or content, believing that showing joy would disrespect her son's memory. Over time, this guilt consumed her, and she began to neglect her health. 18 months after Chad's death, she passed away from severe cardiac failure, having stopped her medical treatments. Sadly, Michelle didn't live to see the conclusion of Bryn's trial. Although no one can be certain, the repeated delays and eventual sentencing of her son's killer likely would have intensified her pain. Therefore, the first formal hearing was not held until November 9, 2023. In that long-awaited trial, Bryn Spacher, now 32 years old and fully recovered, finally testified before the jury. To aid Bryn's hearing impairment, real-time transcription monitoring devices were placed at both the witness stand and her table. Bryn began her testimony by describing her background and then recounted the night of May 27, 2018. She said that after smoking once, Chad encouraged her to try again. When she hesitated, he refilled the water pipe and urged her to inhale immediately to feel the effects. Bryn admitted that although he hadn't physically forced her, his insistence made her feel intimidated and unable to refuse. She testified that Chad wasn't always the gentle person others believed him to be. According to Bryn, she had seen flashes of his temper in the past, and those memories made her feel pressured to comply with his requests. Minutes after smoking a second time, she said she began to feel intensely disoriented. Time seemed to loop, their conversation repeated, and every moment blurred into the next, creating a powerful sense of déjà vu. Bryn testified that she quickly lost the ability to speak coherently, her words dissolving into confusion. Panicked, she went inside, lay down on the couch, and closed her eyes to try to calm down. Instead of finding relief, she began hearing voices and seeing vivid, hallucinatory images behind her closed eyelids. She described the experience as being trapped in an endless cycle of fear, at one point believing she had died and was now imprisoned inside her own body. She said she heard her loved ones crying over her lifeless body and even felt their touch. But what she described next was even more surreal. Bryn claimed she had an out-of-body experience, observing from above as her body lay still on the couch. From that perspective, she said she saw Chad crying beside her while paramedics tried to revive her. Before continuing, she emphasized that everything after that point felt like watching a movie rather than living through it. In her account, She saw herself walking through the apartment, pushing chairs aside before entering the kitchen, where she grabbed 2 knives and threw them at Chad. Then, detached from any sense of control, she took 2 more knives and attacked one of the dogs. Bryn recalled hearing Chad's voice asking why she had hurt Athena, though she later learned it had actually been Arya. Moments later, she approached Chad, raised a knife, and then everything went black. Even while unconscious, she said she could still hear voices in her head, urging her to keep going. Among those voices were Vinny's panicked shouts as he ran from the apartment to get help. Bryn's hallucinations seemed endless, distorting her sense of time so much that she could no longer tell minutes from hours. Overwhelmed by the voices, she heard herself before everything faded away. When she regained consciousness briefly and incompletely, she was met not by clarity, but by chaos. She felt jolts of electricity rippling through her body as officers fired their tasers. Though in her disoriented state, she believed they were using a defibrillator to bring her back to life. She remembered waking up in the hospital as investigators began questioning her about the night's events. Her recollection, however, was fragmented, blurred between what had actually happened and what she might have imagined during her hallucinations. It wasn't until 2 days later that police informed her she had killed Chad. During the trial, the defense referred to forensic tests conducted on a water pipe found at the scene and brought in an expert to explain the results. Experts say that tests for detecting banned substances are not always completely accurate, as some compounds may go undetected. While the report confirmed the presence of THC, the main psychoactive compound in cannabis, the specialist noted that the substance could have been mixed with other drugs. This possibility was especially plausible if Chad had purchased the marijuana from an unlicensed dealer, who might have added other substances to enhance its effects or reduce costs. Although recreational marijuana was already legal in California at the time, Bryn's defense team argued that an important detail had been overlooked. Chad's roommate, Vinny, had also smoked the same substance earlier that night and claimed to have experienced hallucinations. The defense used this to argue that Bryn, an inexperienced user, didn't know what she was consuming and had been pressured into trying it without understanding the potential risks. Their case was supported by testimony from people who knew Bryn personally. Several former classmates stated that Bryn had always avoided banned substances, even distancing herself from friends who used them. One of them, 33-year-old Amy Kerouac, met Bryn in 2007 and described how they became close in high school through shared interests. While Bryn played basketball and Amy played softball, both bonded over their love of outdoor activities like hiking and camping, which were uncommon among their peers. Bryn's first encounter with marijuana occurred in 2014 while she was dating Kevin, a former Marine and personal trainer. During a camping trip in the Washington mountains, they decided to try a joint but quickly found they didn't enjoy it. Kevin later said he believed Chad may have pressured Bryn into smoking on the night in question in 2018. Although Bryn and Kevin broke up in 2017 when she moved to California, he described her as easygoing, kind, and genuine. Given these circumstances, the defense built their argument around the idea that Bryn had been unknowingly intoxicated. According to the California Penal Code, a person may be exempt from criminal liability if they commit an offense under duress or as a result of consuming a controlled substance without their knowledge. Despite this reasoning, the jury rejected the defense's argument. The biggest obstacle for both sides was Bryn's written statement to police while she was hospitalized. In it, she admitted that she had voluntarily taken a second hit from Chad's pipe. Later, Bryn claimed the document had been withheld from the prosecution for some time. However, during one hearing, the prosecutor presented new evidence that significantly altered the case. She portrayed Bryn very differently, presenting text messages from 2018 between Bryn and her friends. In these messages, Bryn wrote about getting so high that she had to miss work the next day and mentioned eating cannabis-infused edibles. This evidence allowed the prosecution to question not only Brynn's earlier statements but also her overall credibility. The prosecutor also highlighted that in most of Brynn's interviews with investigators and doctors, she never mentioned being pressured or coerced. Brynn responded directly to these accusations, saying she sometimes exaggerated when talking with friends, but maintained she had never been so intoxicated that she blacked out or missed work because of marijuana. The only time she had been late, she said, was once after drinking alcohol. Regarding the interrogations, she explained that she didn't repeat every detail because she thought the detectives already knew the facts. After repeatedly restating her responses to challenge the prosecution's claims, the defense called mental health experts to testify. Their evaluations confirmed that Brynn had no history of mental illness or violent tendencies, supporting the argument that her actions were the result of a marijuana-induced psychotic episode. This evidence seriously weakened the prosecution's case and led the jury to reduce the charge. On December 1, 2023, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Brynn Spacher was guilty of involuntary manslaughter, not murder. The decision shocked Chad's family and friends, who had hoped for a harsher outcome. On the evening of January 22, 2024, the night before sentencing, Chad's loved ones gathered outside the county government building to demand justice and a punishment that reflected the brutality of his death. The following day, the courtroom was packed with people, including members of the public, journalists, and Chad's family. When Brynn took the stand one final time, she delivered an emotional apology to Chad's family, addressing her words especially to his father, who continued to mourn his son without Michelle by his side. After nearly 6 years of waiting and suffering, the judge handed down the sentence. Brynn received 2 years of probation, instead of the 5 years of imprisonment initially recommended. She also had to complete 100 hours of community service, focusing on education about marijuana-induced psychosis. The judge warned that any violation of probation would result in immediate imprisonment. In the aftermath, Sean O'Melia, still mourning his son, denounced the ruling as unfair and biased, suggesting that Brynn's gender and race may have influenced the court's leniency. He also expressed concern that the verdict sent a dangerous message, implying that marijuana users could excuse reckless or criminal acts. Sean suggested that Brynn needed a psychiatric evaluation to better understand the biological causes, as he believed that marijuana alone could not explain the full severity of her psychosis. The prosecutor also shared this concern, arguing that the sentence was too lenient, setting a dangerous precedent and damaging the credibility of the justice system. She argued that classifying the case as involuntary manslaughter ignored the brutality of the act, describing it as one of the most disturbing cases in her 29-year career. The outcome of Brynn's trial and Chad's tragic death fueled a broader public debate about recreational marijuana use. A leading forensic psychiatrist noted that the growing acceptance of cannabis has led to widespread misinformation about its risks. He emphasized that while psychotic reactions are uncommon, they can be severe, and studies show a clear link between cannabis use and psychosis. As public criticism mounted, Brynn's trial became a focal point for larger discussions about marijuana's potential dangers. People began to question whether cannabis directly causes violent behavior or acts only as a trigger when combined with other psychological or environmental factors. The hole in the roof was small. Too small, some would later say. It punched through the ceiling of a conference room in the Belvedere Hotel's annex in Baltimore. Beneath it, in a quiet space rarely used, lay the decomposing body of a man who had been missing for 8 days. His name was Ray Rivera. Ray was 32 years old. He was a writer and a husband. According to his loved ones, he had no reason to vanish without explanation. The discovery came on May 24, 2006. Not through police procedure, but by chance. According to reports, employees noticed vultures gathering on the rooftop of the annex, an unusual and unsettling sight in the middle of the city. When the area was checked, the body was found below, in a position that raised more questions than answers. Authorities quickly began reconstructing what might have happened. The most immediate theory was a fall from the roof of the historic Belvedere Hotel. But the scene resisted simplicity. The distance from the main roof to the hole in the annex was significant. Investigators would later note that reaching that point would require either a running jump or a trajectory difficult to reconcile with a straightforward fall. According to structural assessments and reporting by outlets such as the Baltimore Sun, the physics of the incident did not align neatly with conventional expectations. Ray's glasses and cell phone were found near the hole. They appeared largely intact. Not shattered. Not significantly damaged. This detail, documented in investigative reports and later highlighted in true crime analyses, introduced immediate doubt. Objects subjected to a fall from such a height would typically show more visible impact. Inside the building, the silence lingered. There were no clear witnesses. No confirmed sightings of Ray entering the hotel that night. No security footage has been publicly released that could trace his final steps. The Belvedere, once grand and lively, now held a secret in its quiet corners. As investigators stood over the scene, the case began to divide into possibilities. An accident seemed unlikely. The option of ending his own life was considered, but it wasn't immediately supported by those who knew him. Behind the main investigation, a less obvious mystery started to emerge. Ray hadn't just fallen to his death. First, he had disappeared. This disappearance, in the days leading up to the discovery of his body, became the initial part of a mystery that remained unsolved. The central question shifted from how he died to why he was even at that location. Before his death, before the discovery of the hole in the roof, Ray seemed to have a well-organized and meaningful life. He intentionally moved to Baltimore from his home state of California. Those who knew him described Ray as a creative and ambitious person who valued his strong and supportive relationships. Ray worked as a writer, pursuing opportunities in film and financial publishing. At the time of his death, he was contributing to the Rebound Report, a newsletter affiliated with Stansberry and Associates, a financial research firm based in Baltimore. The company was founded by Porter Stansberry, a longtime friend of Ray's. According to publicly available information and interviews later referenced in investigative programs like Unsolved Mysteries, it was this friendship that took Ray across the country. That detail mattered, because it meant Ray was not isolated. He had arrived in Baltimore with trust already in place. At home, his life centered around his wife, Allison Rivera. Their relationship, by most accounts, was close and stable. Allison would later state that there were no clear signs of distress, no conversations suggesting Ray intended to leave or harm himself. They had plans. They had routines. They were building a future together. But beneath that surface, subtle shifts began to emerge. According to Allison and others interviewed during the investigation, Ray had recently expressed concerns about safety. He had installed an alarm system in their home. He reportedly reacted strongly to unexpected noises. These details, while not definitive, introduced a layer of unease that investigators would later revisit. There were also professional pressures. Working in financial publishing required precision, deadlines, and, at times, navigating controversial market opinions. While there is no official confirmation linking his work to any direct threat, the environment itself was not without tension. According to available reporting, Ray had also begun pursuing screenwriting more seriously, suggesting a man balancing multiple ambitions. Later, investigators would find the note hidden behind his computer. A long, cryptic document filled with references to films, secret societies, and coded language. Its existence would cast a shadow backward over everything known about Ray's state of mind. At the time, however, none of this was visible. To his friends, Ray was engaged. To his wife, he was present. To colleagues, he was working. There were no obvious cracks. Let's go back to May 16, 2006. Nothing, at first, suggested it would be the last normal moment in Ray's life. He was at home with his wife, Allison, in their Baltimore residence. The day had passed without incident. There were no visible signs of distress. No arguments. No unusual behavior that would later stand out as a warning. According to Allison's account, the evening felt ordinary, quiet, and routine. Then the phone rang, and Ray answered. What happened in that brief exchange would never be fully confirmed. The call came through the switchboard of Stansberry and Associates, according to later reports. But the exact caller was never publicly identified. No recording. No transcript. After the call, Ray's demeanor changed immediately. According to Allison, he seemed surprised and in a hurry. He didn't say what they talked about. He left the house right away, quickly and suddenly, like he had to deal with something important immediately. He ran out the door. Ray got into his car and drove off into the Baltimore night. It would be the last confirmed sighting of Ray Rivera alive. From that point forward, the timeline begins to fracture. There were no confirmed witnesses placing him at the Belvedere Hotel. No verified footage has been publicly released that tracked his movements through the city. According to available investigative accounts, his car would later be found parked near the Belvedere, but even that discovery raised questions. The location was not where one would necessarily expect, and it did not provide a clear path explaining how Ray entered the building. In his house, small things now seemed important. His belongings were still there, his work and his plans. Nothing suggested he meant to be gone for long. He hadn't packed, left a note, or made any preparations to disappear. Just a phone call and a sudden departure. Allison later recalled that Ray didn't seem at all like she was saying goodbye forever. His voice and actions gave no indication that this was a final farewell or that anything was about to drastically change. Only urgency. As hours turned into a full night, then into the next day, concern began to grow. Calls went unanswered. Ray did not return home. He did not contact anyone. The silence deepened. And with it, a question that would haunt the investigation from the very beginning: what was said in that phone call? Because whatever Ray heard in those final moments was enough to pull him out of his home, into the dark, and toward a destination that, at least on the surface, made no sense. The investigation would soon begin. But already, something was wrong. This was not a man who simply vanished. He was called in. Ray didn't come home that night. Initially, it was easy to assume a reason for his absence, a meeting that ran late, an unplanned task. Something that would only delay him briefly. However, as time passed and the next day began, those explanations became less believable. Allison Rivera was out of town on a business trip. According to her later statements, she tried to reach Ray repeatedly. Each call went unanswered. No reply. No message. The silence was complete. By the second day, concern turned into alarm. Friends and colleagues were contacted. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. There were no reports of Ray arriving at work, no indication he had followed through on any plans. The routine of his life had been abruptly interrupted, and no one could explain why. A missing persons report was filed with the Baltimore Police Department. The investigation began in fragments. Officers started with the last known moment, the phone call. According to the investigation, it had originated from the switchboard of Stansberry and Associates. But when detectives attempted to trace it further, they encountered resistance. The company, according to multiple reports, including later media investigations, did not cooperate beyond confirming the call came through their system. Employees were reportedly instructed not to speak with the police. That silence became its own kind of evidence. Without a clear caller, investigators were left with a void at the center of the timeline. A trigger with no source. A final moment that could not be reconstructed. Attention then shifted outward. Search efforts expanded across Baltimore. Police canvassed areas Ray was known to frequent. Posters were distributed. Friends and family organized their own searches, walking streets, checking parking lots, revisiting any place Ray might have gone. According to accounts later featured in Unsolved Mysteries, the effort was persistent. Ray vanished completely after leaving home. There were no signs of him, no one saw him, his credit cards and bank accounts weren't used, and there was no digital activity to indicate where he went. Days passed. Each passing day narrowed the window of possibility. Investigators began to consider scenarios beyond voluntary disappearance. An accident. Foul play. Something hidden. Then came a development that shifted the investigation. Ray's car was found. It was parked near the Belvedere Hotel. Not in a location that immediately drew attention, but close enough to introduce a new focal point. The discovery was significant. It anchored Ray to a physical place for the first time since he vanished. The Belvedere itself was a complex structure. Historic. Layered. With multiple access points, both public and private. According to investigators, determining how Ray might have entered, or where he had gone once inside, was not straightforward. Still, the search around the building did not immediately reveal anything. For several more days, nothing. Nobody. No clear evidence. Only the car, sitting quietly near a building that, at that point, held no visible answers. The investigation stalled in uncertainty. Until something changed. Something was watching from above. The Belvedere Hotel had already entered the investigation as a point of interest. Ray's car had been found nearby. Detectives had noted it, logged it, but without a body, without evidence inside the building, the connection remained incomplete. Then, on May 24, 2006, something drew attention upward. According to reports, employees noticed vultures circling and gathering near the rooftop of the Belvedere's annex. It was an unusual sight in downtown Baltimore. Persistent. Focused. Enough to raise concern. When the area was checked, the search moved inward. And there, inside a rarely used conference room beneath the annex roof, Ray Rivera was found. The discovery was immediate and deeply unsettling. There was a hole in the ceiling. Directly above where his body lay, the roof had been punctured from above, creating an opening that investigators believed marked the point of entry. It suggested a fall from height. But almost instantly, the physical realities of that fall began to resist explanation. The main roof of the Belvedere stood at a considerable distance from the location of the hole. According to structural assessments and reporting, including analysis cited by the Baltimore Sun, Ray would have had to travel a significant horizontal distance during the fall, far more than what would typically occur in a vertical drop. Investigators considered possible jump points. One theory suggested he may have run and leapt from the main roof. But even that raised questions. The required velocity, the trajectory, and the precision needed to reach that specific section of the annex roof, none of it aligned comfortably with a spontaneous act. Another possibility was a fall from a lower ledge. But access to such areas was limited, and no clear evidence confirmed that Ray had been there. Inside the room, more details complicated the picture. Ray's body showed signs of severe trauma consistent with a high fall. But according to the medical examiner's report, some injuries were described as unusual or not entirely consistent with the expected pattern. These findings would later contribute to the ruling of the cause of death as undetermined. His glasses and cell phone were found near the hole, remarkably intact. Not destroyed. Not fragmented in a way typically associated with a fall from that height. This detail, noted in investigative records and later highlighted in multiple analyses, became one of the most debated elements of the case. Nearby, his flip-flops were also recovered. Broken, but not in a way that clearly matched the force of the impact below. Each piece of evidence seemed to tell a slightly different story, and none of them fully aligned. There were no confirmed witnesses placing Ray on the roof that night. No clear record of how he entered the building, no indication of forced access. The Belvedere, with its layered architecture and partial renovations, offered possibilities but no definitive answers. The scene suggested a fall, but not a simple one. Investigators now faced a new phase of the case, not a disappearance, but a reconstruction. A puzzle defined by physics, timing, and silence. The question was no longer where Ray Rivera was. It was how he got there, and whether he had been alone when he did. After the body was found, the investigation turned inward, back to Ray's home, back to the life he had left behind. It was there that investigators uncovered something unexpected. Behind Ray's computer, taped carefully to the back, was a note. It was not immediately visible. It had been folded, reduced in size, almost concealed. According to investigative reports and later coverage in Unsolved Mysteries, the note had been printed in extremely small font, so small it appeared intentionally compressed, as if meant to be hidden or overlooked. When unfolded, its contents raised more questions than answers. The text did not read like a conventional letter. It was not addressed to a specific person. It did not clearly explain the intent. Instead, it moved through a series of fragmented thoughts, references to films, celebrities, Freemasonry, and what appeared to be coded or symbolic language. Names appeared. Phrases repeated. There were lists, some seemingly random, others possibly structured with meaning not immediately understood. To investigators, the note introduced a new dimension to the case. Was this a personal manifesto? A piece of creative writing? Or evidence of a disturbed mental state? According to Allison, the note did not resemble anything Ray had previously written. She later stated that while Ray was creative and thoughtful, this document felt different, disconnected, unusual in tone and structure. The placement of the note also stood out. It was hidden. This duality created uncertainty. If Ray intended it to be found, why hide it? If he intended to keep it private, why not secure it more thoroughly? The note became a focal point in evaluating Ray's psychological condition in the days leading up to his disappearance. Some investigators considered whether it reflected paranoia or delusion. Certain passages referenced secret societies and hidden truths, language that could be interpreted as symbolic or as signs of something more concerning. However, no official diagnosis was ever confirmed. According to available records, Ray had not been formally evaluated for any severe mental health condition prior to his death. The ambiguity remained. Handwriting analysis was not applicable, it was typed. The document itself contained no direct admission, no explicit statement of intent. It neither confirmed nor denied the possibility of ending his life. Instead, it hovered in uncertainty. A message without a clear audience. A structure without a clear meaning. For some, the note suggested internal struggle. For others, it was simply the work of a writer, complex, abstract, unfinished. In this case, the focus changed. The investigation moved beyond just looking at physical evidence and timelines. It began to explore Ray's thoughts. However, this didn't make things clearer. Instead, it made the mystery even deeper. If the note was a clue, it was confusing because it suggested many possibilities, none of which were certain, and all of which were disturbing. The case, already complicated by strange events and unlikely physical occurrences, now had another confusing element. As the investigation progressed, the case became increasingly difficult to solve. They had the body, the place where it was found, and a timeline of what happened. However, these pieces didn't fit together to form a clear picture. Every answer they found only seemed to create more questions and inconsistencies. The medical examiner's report became a central point of tension. Ray's cause of death was not ruled as an end to his life. Nor was it classified as a homicide. Instead, it was labeled undetermined. According to official records, this classification reflected the inconsistencies in both the physical evidence and the broader circumstances surrounding his death. The injuries were severe, consistent in part with a high fall, but not entirely conclusive. Some fractures, as noted in reports, did not clearly match the expected pattern. This ambiguity left the case suspended. How had Ray reached the roof? The Belvedere was not a simple structure. Access to certain areas, particularly the upper levels and ledges, was restricted. According to investigative accounts, there was no definitive evidence showing how Ray entered the building or navigated to a point from which such a fall could occur. No keycard logs publicly released. No witness placing him inside. The path remained invisible. Attention returned again to the phone call. It remained one of the most critical and most opaque elements of the case. The call had originated from the switchboard of Stansberry and Associates. Beyond that, the trail stopped. According to multiple reports, the company declined to cooperate further with police inquiries. Employees were advised not to speak with investigators. No caller was identified. No motive established. That silence carried weight. For some, it suggested nothing more than corporate caution. For others, it introduced the possibility that something relevant, perhaps crucial, remained undisclosed. However, no official findings ever confirmed wrongdoing by the company or its employees. The absence of cooperation remained just that, an absence. There were the objects found at the scene. The glasses. The phone. The flip-flops. Each item challenged expectations. Their condition did not fully match the violence of the fall. According to analyses referenced in investigative reporting and later documentaries, these inconsistencies became focal points for alternative theories. Some suggested staging. Others argued for unknown variables in the fall itself. None could be proven. Over time, theories began to diverge. One path leaned toward ending his life, supported, in part, by the cryptic note and the possibility of internal distress. Another pointed toward an accident, perhaps an attempt to access a restricted area that ended in a fatal misstep. A third, more speculative, raised the possibility of foul play, though no direct evidence confirmed it. Each theory held fragments of truth. The investigation slowed. Leads diminished. The case, once urgent, began to settle into a state familiar to unresolved mysteries, incomplete, contested, and quietly fading from official momentum. But for those closest to Ray, the questions did not fade. They remained sharp. Years passed, but the case did not settle. Ray Rivera's death remained suspended in uncertainty, never fully explained, never formally resolved. The official ruling of undetermined endured, a rare classification that reflected not just a lack of evidence, but a conflict within the evidence itself. For Alison Rivera, the absence of answers became its own form of permanence. She continued to speak publicly about the case, emphasizing what she believed investigators had not been able to reconcile. The trajectory of the fall. The condition of Ray's belongings. The unanswered questions surrounding the phone call. To her, these were not minor inconsistencies, They were fractures in the narrative that prevented closure. According to interviews and later coverage, including the 2020 revival of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix, the case reached a new audience. Viewers were introduced to the details, the contradictions, the lingering sense that something essential had been missed. Public interest surged again, bringing renewed scrutiny to a case that had long remained in the shadows. But renewed attention did not bring resolution. No new witness came forward with definitive information. No previously hidden evidence emerged to clarify the sequence of events. The core questions remained unchanged. How did Ray reach the roof? What was said in the phone call? Why did the physical evidence not fully align with a simple fall? And perhaps most persistently, was Ray Rivera alone in those final moments? Authorities, bound by the available evidence, did not reopen the case as a criminal investigation. There was no official declaration of foul play. At the same time, there was no conclusion that could definitively explain his death as either the end of his life or an accident. The case remained in a narrow, unresolved space. Over time, it became more than a single incident. It became a reflection of the limits of investigation itself. Even with physical evidence, timelines, and analysis, some cases resist clarity, not because they lack data, but because the data does not agree. For the public, the case invites speculation. For the family, it remains personal. A life interrupted. A story without an ending. And beneath it all, a quiet, persistent truth: not every mystery fades with time. Some remain, unchanged, unanswered, and waiting. Because in the end, the case of Ray Rivera does not conclude. It lingers. In the space between what is known and what may never be. In the early hours of New Year's Day 2018, two young lovers stepped out of a nightclub in La Paz, Bolivia, but they never come home. 19 days later, on January 19, 2018, police and rescue teams stood on the banks of the Orcoja-Huira River. That morning, divers and forensic specialists began hauling strange, heavy bundles from the riverbed. When the sack was cut open, the scene was horrific. Inside were two bodies decomposed serious. Days spent trapped in water and darkness had ravaged them. Identification by sight alone was impossible. After initial examination, a chilling common detail emerged. Both victims had suffered severe traumatic brain injuries. The damage indicated they were struck with a blunt object wielded with tremendous force. This was not an accidental fall. The victims were murdered deliberately and brutally, then thrown into the river like construction debris to erase traces of the crime. The victims were later identified as Carla Bellot and Jesus Cañicer. Both were born in 1992. Their lives ran along similar lines from an early age. In 2003, both families suffered the same tragedy. Each lost their father. After the loss, Carla's mother moved her 5 younger children from Santa Cruz de la Sierra to La Paz, trying to rebuild. As the eldest, Carla took responsibility. She helped raise her siblings, monitored homework, curfews, behavior. She enrolled in accounting and completed her certification through accelerated classes so she could start working sooner, contribute to the household finances. The story in the Cañicer family is almost identical. Jesus grew up with 3 older sisters, but as the only son, he became the principal support for his mother, who was a seamstress. He didn't just keep order in the house, he helped with her tailoring work, taking sewing jobs when necessary. At family weddings, he escorted his sisters down the aisle, standing in the place where their father once would have been. At the time of his disappearance, Jesus was completing his economics degree and finishing the final work on his thesis. Carla and Jesus met at a college party in 2008. Their relationship developed gradually through long talks and walks home together. Eventually, their friendship turned into a romance. Carla kept their relationship a secret for a while, finally introducing Jesus as her boyfriend at her graduation party. They were what many would call a homely couple. They weren't drawn to loud parties or nightlife. They preferred family gatherings, small trips, quiet weekends. They had a clear plan. As soon as Jesus completed his thesis defense, they'd get married and start their life together in their own place. The timeline for January 1, 2018 has been reconstructed through digital breadcrumbs. Carla and Jesus had never planned on ringing in the new year with an all-night celebration. They only agreed to go to the Planta Baja Club after being persuaded by friends. Around 4 a.m., Carla posted a photo on Facebook. The two looked happy, smiling, relaxed, enjoying the concert, the festive atmosphere. About an hour later, their activity shifted from social media to private chats. They messaged family members, saying they would leave the club at 6 a.m. and should be home around 7 a.m. At the same time, Jesus sent a series of messages to his sisters and to Carla's brother-in-law. These were not typical New Year greetings. He wrote that he loved them and promised to take care of Carla. The wording was strange, almost like a farewell. It unsettled the recipients, but there was still no reason to panic. That day was Carla's nephew's birthday. Both she and Jesus were expected at a family lunch. After 7 a.m., their phones still rang, but no one answered. Anxiety rose as the hours passed. They were punctual, reliable, and deeply family-oriented. It is very unusual for them to miss an event without notice. In the early afternoon, Jesus's mother drove to Carla's house. When she arrived, the house was empty and quiet, which made her feel afraid. Something was wrong, because neither family could find Jesus or Carla or figure out what happened. They went to the police. The focus of both the investigation and the public quickly zeroed in on the Planta Baja nightclub, where Carla and Jesus were last seen. The first days quickly turned into a battle. The club's owners refused to cooperate. They would not hand over security footage. They would not allow the families inside. They demanded a court order. Furious and desperate, relatives staged protests outside the entrance, but the doors stayed shut. It wasn't until January 4th that investigators finally gained access. What they found inside raised every possible red flag. The club was operating without a valid license. Security cameras were installed, but none of them were recording. They were props, meant to deter, not document. That meant that the most critical hours of the disappearance were lost forever. The owner's statements then shifted. First, he told police he personally escorted Carla and Jesus outside. Under pressure, he suddenly changed his version, saying it had been a security guard who walked them out. The inconsistency only deepened suspicion. Samples were taken at the club. Hope soared when investigators found blood on the floor. Media outlets speculated that this was the break everyone was waiting for. However, DNA testing destroyed the theory. The blood didn't belong to either victim. Days passed in vain. With no evidence inside Planta Baja, the investigation pivoted. Detectives turned to phone data. Both victims' phones had remained active after they vanished, and the signals were tracked. That digital trail led investigators into a black market of stolen devices. The first major development came from Jesus's phone. Police traced the chain further and reached a taxi driver and his brother. Both admitted they had bought the phone cheaply from someone on the street. Then, on January 17, detectives made a breakthrough. A deep analysis of Jesus's phone geolocation history led them to Israel Leon, a man who had also been at the club that night. Through him, police uncovered a wider circle: Israel's siblings, Elliot and Michaela LF, as well as their partners, Renzo C. and Estefany. What emerged was chilling. According to case files, Carla and Jesus's original group had left the venue much earlier, but Carla and Jesus did not leave with them. Instead, they stayed behind and mingled with a new group, the Leon brothers, whom they had just met at the club. They continued drinking until the club finally closed its doors around 9 in the morning. In broad daylight, the entire group stepped outside. This 4-hour window, from 5 o'clock a.m. to 9 o'clock a.m., dramatically reframed the case. Carla and Jesus were no longer surrounded by familiar faces. They had spent nearly half the night with strangers, fueled by alcohol and a false sense of camaraderie. A nearby business security camera captured the last known footage of them alive: Carla, Jesus, and 3 men, Israel, Elliot, and Renzo C., talking to a taxi driver on the sidewalk. 2 women, Michaela LF and Estefany, were also with them. Eventually, the entire group climbed into cars, planning to continue partying at Israel's house. On the way, they stopped at a roadside stall to buy more alcohol. When they finally arrived at Israel's house, the exhaustion from a sleepless night, combined with heavy drinking, began to take hold. Carla, completely drained, fell asleep almost as soon as she walked in. Israel, the host, passed out in another room. That left 4 people awake in the kitchen: Jesus, Elliot, Renzo, and Estefany. They continued drinking. But with every passing minute, the atmosphere shifted, the party energy died. The room grew tense. Something was brewing. Something dark. Around 11 o'clock a.m., everything changed. Elliot suddenly began berating Jesus, accusing him of pouring drinks the wrong way. What began as mocking turned into sharp insults. As Jesus sobered up, he realized something was wrong. Both his and Carla's phones were missing. He confronted the group, demanding the devices back. Frustrated, he reached toward Elliot's pockets to check for himself. That single moment of physical contact exploded into violence. Elliot punched him. One blow became many. The loud fight woke Israel. Instead of stopping him, he also rushed at Jesus. Renzo followed. The 3 men took turns beating Jesus. The 2 young women, Michaela and Estefany, were present when the violence began. But according to court documents, they did nothing to intervene. Jesus, dazed, wounded, barely conscious, was dragged into another room. Carla, still sleeping and heavily intoxicated, was defenseless. When she awoke, terrified and confused, the 3 attackers turned their rage on her. What happened in that room was brutal. Afterwards, they moved her to the same room where Jesus lay unconscious. The violence continued. The tragic climax came when Jesus regained consciousness. He saw what was being done to Carla and tried to intervene. That act of protection cost him his life. One of the men grabbed a heavy metal pipe and struck Jesus on the head. The blow was fatal. He died almost instantly. With Jesus dead, the attackers turned the heavy metal pipe on Carla. The same pipe was used to take her life. When the final blow landed, the house fell eerily silent. The murderers didn't flee. They stayed in the house for almost 2 whole days, eating, sleeping, and talking, while the bodies decomposed nearby. Only when the streets quieted at night on January 3rd did they act. In the darkness, they wrapped the bodies in coarse jute sacks. The sacks hid the shape, absorbed fluids, and were easier to carry. Instead of using a car, they carried the bodies on foot to the Orcojahuira River, the closest place to dispose of them. They threw the bodies into the river, hoping the current, mud, and passage of time would destroy all traces of the crime. Once investigators had narrowed down the prime suspects, they still needed one crucial piece of evidence: Elliot Leon, described by witnesses as the most violent attacker and the ringleader, had fled. Right away, an international alert was issued. Intelligence reports indicated he was hiding in Sao Paulo. Brazil. A romantic partner who assisted his escape was later investigated for harboring a fugitive. The next phase of the case would unfold beyond Bolivia's borders. The search came to an end on January 26, 2018, when Brazilian authorities finally located and arrested Elliot Leon. He was detained in Sao Paulo and extradited to Bolivia, where investigators were already waiting. During interrogation, Elliot and Israel admitted to participating in the assault and acts of violence, but they fiercely denied delivering the fatal blows with the metal pipe. Elliot claimed that Israel was the one who struck Jesus and Carla, while Israel insisted the opposite, accusing Elliot of being the killer. They understood that whoever had wielded the metal pipe could face the harshest punishment. But for the prosecution, the distinction was irrelevant. The case was defined as a joint criminal act, a coordinated group assault. No role existed in isolation. When the bodies were taken to the morgue, forensic pathologists encountered contradictions that briefly disrupted the investigation. Autopsies confirmed the cause of death. Both victims had suffered massive traumatic brain injuries with significant internal bleeding. Carla's body also showed multiple injuries consistent with violence inflicted while she was still alive. The controversy emerged from the estimated time of death. Early medical reports gave conflicting dates. Jesus was listed as having died on January 4th, while Carla's report suggested she might have lived until January 11th. This raised a terrifying theory, that the victims had been held captive for over a week, possibly tortured. While their families were still begging authorities to find them, the possibility shattered the parents. They endured a new wave of grief, tormented by the idea that their children might have been saved. Eventually, the theory was completely dismissed. Forensic specialists explained that the bodies had been sealed inside thick jute sacks and submerged in river water, creating an abnormal microenvironment that altered decomposition. Once the medical data was matched with witness statements and confessions, authorities confirmed the truth. Carla and Jesus died in the early morning of January 1st, only a few hours after leaving the Planta Baja Club. There was no extended captivity. The trial lasted more than 20 months. The 5 main defendants in the case were Elliot Leon, Israel Leon, Michaela L.F. Leon, Renzo C. Cáceres, and Estefany Guizada. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence proving their participation in the violent acts. In the end, the court delivered the maximum possible punishment under Bolivian law: 30 years in prison without parole for each of them, on charges of femicide, homicide, aggravated assault, and complicity. At a farewell mass, the parents held a symbolic wedding for Carla and Jesus. The young couple had planned to marry after graduation. Now, surrounded by flowers and mourners, their families granted them that wish. They were posthumously declared husband and wife. The perpetrators had taken everything from them except their love. That symbolic wedding was a powerful act of resistance. The families refused to let the story end in horror. Instead, they created another ending, one filled with dignity, tenderness. On September 4, 1894, a burned body discovered in Philadelphia marks the beginning of a case that will later be buried under myth, exaggeration, and spectacle. At first, the facts appear narrow and technical: a corpse chemically altered, a fire staged to suggest an accident, and a name attached to the remains: Benjamin Freelon Pitezel. What investigators uncover in the days that follow is not a crime of passion or chance, but a deliberate act tied to fraud, identity manipulation, and control. The suspect, publicly known as H. Holmes. As the investigation widens beyond one body and stretches across state and national borders, it becomes clear that Pitezel's murder is not the end of a scheme but its first clue, showing how ordinary trust can be exploited. Holmes was adept at disappearing within his own disguises. In the record, he is a con artist with a long resume: fraud, swindles, shifting identities, moving city to city as if motion itself can erase accountability. But in Philadelphia, motion becomes traceable. A murder charge does not care how charming a man can sound when he lies. And a question forms early: if Holmes was willing to kill the partner he needed for the con, what else was he willing to do once the fraud stopped being enough? What comes next is the pivot investigators cling to, the narrowing from myth to measurable proof. Because Pitezel is not the end of the story, he is the doorway, and behind it, 3 children will vanish into the same trail, forcing the case to expand beyond a single body into a hunt across borders. The man the newspapers call H. Holmes did not begin that way. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861 in rural New Hampshire. That is the first verifiable fact investigators return to when the story begins to swell beyond control. Accounts from court records and contemporary reports portray his early life as quiet and unremarkable. He studies medicine and anatomy, learning to translate bodies into paperwork. The investigation file suggests that even before Chicago, there were hints of fraud, insurance schemes using cadavers, false claims, debts left behind like footprints in snow. Nothing sensational, but a pattern emerges, profiting by manipulating death without causing it, at least at first, allegedly. What makes Holmes dangerous is not violence alone, it is adaptability. He marries more than once, he abandons his spouses without divorcing, he assumes roles easily: doctor, entrepreneur, husband, widower. Each identity overlaps with another. When one collapses, he steps sideways into the next. Investigators later note how difficult it is to chart his movements because his life is not linear, it is layered. By the late 1882, Mudgett had fully recast himself. He becomes Henry Howard Holmes. Chicago offers anonymity and opportunity. The city is expanding. People are arriving faster than records can keep up. Holmes understands something crucial. In a growing city, absence does not always register as an alarm. Holmes is not hiding in the shadows. He operates in daylight. He runs pharmacies. He hires workers, then dismisses them before they fully understand what they're building. According to later testimony, he keeps financial control tight and personal details vague. No one ever sees the full structure. Investigators looking back see this as preparation, not for a single crime, but for insulation. When questions come, there is always another address, another name, another explanation ready. And that raises the next question, one that law enforcement would not fully confront until years later. When a man practices becoming someone else for so long, how do you prove who he was when the crimes occurred? Because Chicago is where Holmes stops merely borrowing from death and begins designing around it. On the corner of West 63rd Street and Wallace Avenue, in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood, a building began to rise in the early 1892s. It is later called a castle, but at the time, it is something simpler and more deceptive. A mixed-use structure with shops on the ground floor and rooms above. The fact is clear and documented. Holmes owns the property. He oversees its construction, and he does so in fragments. Workers are hired and fired in quick succession. According to later testimony, no one stays long enough to understand the full layout. Staircases lead nowhere. Hallways bend oddly. Rooms are sealed off. Whether these features were intentionally designed for murder has been debated for more than a century. What is officially confirmed is narrower. Holmes controlled access, withheld plans, and ensured that no single person ever saw the whole. The hotel sits near the grounds of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Chicago is flooded with visitors. Holmes advertises jobs. Young women arrive alone, seeking work. He offers lodging. Some of these women are later documented as employees or acquaintances. Some disappear from the historical record shortly after. Investigators would later struggle to determine how many vanishings can be directly tied to Holmes and how many were absorbed into the noise of a city in motion. Years later, when police eventually search building, they do not find a neatly preserved crime scene. They find alterations, removals, a structure already stripped of much physical proof. Sensational accounts would later exaggerate what was found. The investigation file is more restrained. It notes chutes, locked rooms, and evidence of chemical use. Enough to disturb, not enough to convict. This becomes a critical investigative problem. If the hotel can't speak clearly, the case must rest on something else: paper, letters, movements, and the people who left Chicago with Holmes and never returned. That shifts the focus away from the building itself and toward the relationships formed inside it. Because the next provable crime does not happen in Englewood. It happens on the road. At the center of that road is Benjamin Freelon Pitezel, still alive, still trusting, and about to be used not as a partner, but as a template. Benjamin enters the record not as a victim, but as a collaborator. That is the first uncomfortable fact. He is a carpenter, a father, a man with debts and limited options. By 1894, he is working with Holmes on a plan that appears, on paper, almost harmless: a life insurance fraud. Benjamin will fake his death. Holmes will collect the payout. They will split the money. According to court testimony, Benjamin agrees. The scheme is documented. The trust is real. There is no sign, at least initially, that Benjamin believes his life is at risk. He writes letters to his wife. He follows instructions. He rents a room in Philadelphia under an assumed name. This is where the deviation occurs. Benjamin does not disappear as planned. He dies. The medical evidence presented at trial is precise for its time. Benjamin is killed before the fire. Chloroform is found in his system. His throat is cut. The burning comes after. The scene is staged to support the fraud, but the order of events betrays intent. According to the investigation file and trial record, this is not a mistake or escalation. It is a decision. What follows deepens the crime. Holmes does not flee immediately. Instead, he steps into the role Benjamin can no longer play. He meets with the insurance company. He presents documentation. He convinces them of the death. He collects the money. Then he turns to Benjamin's family, not to confess, but to continue the lie. Holmes tells Mrs. Benjamin that her husband is alive and hiding. He offers to protect 3 of her children while authorities search for the missing man. This is one of the coldest moments in the case, because it is fully unnecessary. The money has already been paid. The murder is complete, yet Holmes chooses control over distance. This is no longer about fraud. It is about power. According to later testimony and correspondence, Holmes moved the children across state lines. He writes letters in Benjamin's name. He keeps the family compliant with hope. And this raises the next investigative question, one that will pull federal authorities into the case. If Holmes has already killed to secure the fraud, why keep the children at all? The answer will not come quickly. It will come through travel records, rented rooms, and a detective who decides to follow the letters. After Holmes is arrested on insurance fraud charges, the task of finding the Pitezel children falls to Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police. The fact guiding his work is simple and devastating. 3 children are missing, and the last confirmed adult with them is now in custody. According to the investigation file and later court testimony, Holmes has left a trail on paper notes sent to Mrs. Pitezel, instructions about where the children are supposedly being kept, and explanations that shift just enough to delay panic. Geyer does not challenge the letters. He follows them. He heads west, then north: Indianapolis, Detroit, Toronto. At each stop, he checks boarding houses, hotels, and rented rooms, questioning landlords who recall a quiet man traveling with children. The descriptions match: calm, polite, passing through. The trail cools, but it doesn't disappear. In Toronto, the investigation reaches its first irreversible turn. Geyer finds a rented house tied directly to Holmes. Inside, the evidence is not symbolic, it is physical. 2 of the Pitezel children are discovered buried in the cellar. According to the coroner's findings, they were killed deliberately. The cause of death is not accidental. The setting offers no ambiguity. The case has crossed from suspected homicide into documented multiple murder. Geyer does not stop. He returns to the United States and continues the search for the 3rd child, Howard Pitezel. In Indianapolis, the final location resolves the last uncertainty. The remains of the boy were found in a chimney. The forensic conclusions align with what was already known. The children were killed after being moved repeatedly. Their deaths are not tied to panic or impulse. They are spaced, planned, and concealed. This sequence becomes the backbone of the prosecution. Unlike the Chicago property, unlike the rumors, the children's deaths are anchored to places, dates, and actions Holmes cannot reframe. Geyer transforms suspicion into a narrative that the court can understand, and it leads to a question Holmes can no longer escape. If the murders of the children were unnecessary to the fraud, what did Holmes gain by keeping them alive long enough to move them and kill them, one by one? The trial begins in October 1895, not with legends, but with restraint. The prosecution makes a deliberate choice. Despite the growing number of suspected victims and the mounting public pressure, Holmes is charged with a single murder, the killing of Benjamin Freeland Pitezel. This is the fact the state believes it can prove beyond doubt. Outside, newspapers speculate about dozens, even hundreds of victims. Inside, the judge limits the scope. Rumor is excluded. Sensation is filtered out. What remains is evidence that can survive cross-examination. The medical testimony is central. Doctors testify that Benjamin was rendered unconscious with chloroform before his throat was cut. The fire came later. This sequence dismantles the defense's suggestion of an accidental death during a fraud gone wrong. According to the trial record, the jury is shown how the scene was staged and how the chemistry contradicts Holmes's account. Holmes takes the stand. He speaks calmly. He denies the murder. He shifts blame. At times, he suggests that Benjamin died accidentally, that the children were alive when he last saw them, and that others are responsible. His statements are internally inconsistent. Dates slide. Locations blur. The prosecution does not rush him. They let the contradictions accumulate. The feeling in the courtroom changes as the trial progresses. Holmes's intelligence is evident, but so is his detachment. Witnesses describe his behavior after the murder: collecting insurance money, managing correspondence, and maintaining control. The jury is asked to consider not just what happened in that Philadelphia room, but what Holmes did afterward, and why. Detective Geyer's findings are introduced carefully, not to expand the charges, but to establish pattern and intent. The children's deaths are referenced as context, not as counts. The message is subtle and devastating. This was not an isolated decision. On November 30, 1895, the jury returns its verdict: guilty. Holmes is sentenced to death. The legal system has spoken, narrowly and decisively, but conviction does not bring clarity. Instead, it creates a new incentive. With appeals exhausted and execution scheduled, Holmes begins to talk, not to the court, but to the public. With the verdict secured and the sentence fixed, Holmes enters a different phase of the case, one not governed by evidence, rules, or judges' instructions. He begins to confess, not once, but many times. Each version is different. Each one is offered to a newspaper willing to pay. The fact investigators and historians agree on is this: Holmes gave multiple confessions in the months leading up to his execution, and they contradict one another. In some accounts, he claims 27 victims. In others, far fewer. At times, he insists he feels remorse. In others, he describes himself as detached, even hollow. According to contemporary journalism and later analysis, Holmes understood the value of narrative. He knew attention could be monetized. Reporters compete for access. Headlines grow darker. Numbers inflate. The public appetite for horror expands faster than verification can follow. Holmes feeds that appetite selectively. He offers just enough detail to sound credible, then shifts the frame. Names change. Locations blur. The confessions become performances. Investigators are skeptical. According to the investigation file and later scholarly review, many claims Holmes makes cannot be corroborated by missing persons reports, timelines, or physical evidence. Some alleged victims are later found alive. What remains provable stays small: Benjamin Pitezel and Pitezel's 3 children. This distinction matters, because it separates what Holmes did from what he wanted to be remembered for. His confessions inflate his myth. The record deflates it. Holmes, allegedly, exaggerates his crimes for profit and control, even as his own life narrows to a cell. The feeling here is unsettling, not because of what Holmes says, but because of how easily the story slips away from the victims. Their names are overshadowed by his. Their lives are reduced to numbers that rise and fall depending on the edition. In his final statements, Holmes claims his body is inhabited by the devil. It is one of his most quoted lines. Investigators dismiss it. There is no evidentiary value. It explains nothing. It only redirects attention. On a May morning in Philadelphia, the state will end Holmes's ability to speak and fix his story in silence. At 10:13 am, on May 7, 1896, in Moyamensing Prison, Philadelphia, H. Holmes is led to the gallows. This is the final, verifiable fact in the case. The execution is orderly, witnessed, documented. Holmes does not struggle. According to official accounts, his death is not immediate. The drop does not break his neck. He dies slowly, over several minutes, as the crowd watches in silence. Holmes's last requests are practical. He asks that his body be buried in concrete, deep enough to prevent grave robbers. Even in death, he seeks control, over access, over narrative, over what remains. With the execution complete, the legal case closes, but resolution does not follow. Holmes leaves behind a vacuum filled quickly by myth. Newspapers continue to publish inflated victim counts. The Chicago building is retroactively transformed into a chamber of horrors. Details are added that cannot be traced to police records or court testimony. Over time, the legend overtakes the evidence. The fact remains narrower and colder. Holmes is a convicted murderer of Benjamin Pitezel. He is responsible, beyond dispute, for the deaths of Pitezel's 3 children. Everything beyond that exists in contested space, some possible, some exaggerated, some invented outright. The investigation never produces a definitive number of total victims. That uncertainty is not a failure of justice. It is the limit of proof. The feeling that lingers is not fear, but unease. Holmes did not rely on brute force or chaos. He relied on systems, insurance, housing, trust, anonymity. He exploited how people assume paperwork equals safety and how movement can erase attention. The case exposes a social vulnerability as much as an individual crime. Holmes's name endures in history books and documentaries. Their names surface more quietly, carried by court records and burial sites. And that is the final question the case leaves behind, unresolved and still relevant. When society remembers the architect of a crime more vividly than the people erased by it, who is justice really serving? In a small American town, Thanksgiving Day started peacefully. 3 young boys were spending the holiday with their father, according to a court agreement. Everything appeared normal. However, by the following morning, this seemingly ordinary day had turned into a nightmare. There were no witnesses and no explanations. The boys had vanished. What occurred in the hours before they disappeared? And was their father, the person they should have been able to trust, concealing a shocking secret? Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 2010, was a quiet day in Morenci, Michigan, a town known for its predictable routines. That morning, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton spent time with their father, John Skelton, as part of a planned holiday visit. This was a regular arrangement due to their parents' separation. However, the following day, this routine would shatter. Andrew was 9, Alexander was 7, and Tanner was 5. At their young ages, they relied on trust and familiar voices. The investigation revealed that this Thanksgiving visit was supposed to end with the boys returning to their mother, Tanya Zuvers, on Friday. But that return never happened. On the afternoon of November 26th, Tanya reported her sons missing because she couldn't contact their father, John Skelton. Crucially, the last time the boys were seen, they were with John. At first, investigators hoped it was just a misunderstanding, a missed call, a delay, or irresponsible behavior from a father dealing with a tough divorce. They believed the boys would be found quickly. However, as time went on and John remained unreachable, their concern grew. Calls weren't answered, arrangements were missed, and the expected return never happened. The location itself added to the unease. In a small town like Morenci, people don't easily disappear. Distances are short, and movements are easily noticed. The disappearance of the 3 children quickly became a matter of community concern. Yet, as the first night went by, there were no confirmed sightings, no accidental discoveries, and no clear leads. Only 3 missing boys and a father who couldn't be contacted. Then, the tone of the case shifted dramatically. Authorities located John Skelton, but not the children. Reports indicate he was found in a state of panic, having attempted to harm himself. This changed the course of the investigation. It was no longer a simple delay or misunderstanding, but something more complex and disturbing. Investigators faced a critical question. The last person confirmed to have seen the boys was found, but the children were missing. The timeline had narrowed significantly, and the emotional atmosphere shifted from confusion to dread. In the growing space between known facts and the boys' absence, a crucial question emerged. If the 3 boys were in their father's care at the end of Thanksgiving, where did they go before morning? The problems leading to the disappearance began long before Thanksgiving 2010. The issues stemmed from a marriage falling apart. John Skelton and Tanya Zuvers were in the midst of a tense divorce, according to court records, which had intensified in the months leading up to November. The legal proceedings divided the family, impacting not only the 2 adults but also the daily lives of the 3 children caught in the middle. The documented facts, found in filings and testimony, revealed that Tanya had filed for divorce in September 2010. She was granted primary custody of the boys, while John had scheduled visitation rights. On paper, it was a standard arrangement. However, in reality, it was emotionally charged. Friends and relatives later described a relationship filled with conflict, distrust, and increasing arguments. The boys transitioned between 2 homes, 2 environments, and 2 versions of stability. This tension became the backdrop for everything that followed. There were also warning signs that started subtly, but became harder to ignore. According to the investigation, John Skelton had begun expressing fears about losing access to his children. He talked about control, separation, and outcomes he couldn't accept. Some statements, later reviewed by authorities, suggested a growing instability. He allegedly mentioned extreme scenarios, including concerns that the children would be permanently taken away from him. At the time, it was unclear if these were emotional reactions or something more deliberate. However, investigators would later revisit these moments, viewing them as early warning signals. Inside the house, things had changed. The boys seemed happy and were close to their mother. They went to school, played sports, and followed a normal routine. However, the tension between their parents was obvious. Children often sense when something is wrong, even if they don't understand it. The important question is not if the boys noticed the tension, but how much it affected them. Then, the court got involved and set up custody rules. These rules are meant to help, but they can also cause stress. Thanksgiving 2010 was one of those stressful times. It was John's turn to have the boys, meaning he was fully responsible for them during that specific time. This is important to the investigation because it was the last time anyone knew for sure the boys were safe and with their father, as the court had ordered. Investigators later realized that in custody cases, a disappearance rarely happens suddenly. It usually starts earlier with arguments, fears, and unresolved issues. The disappearance is just the final result, but the real story began long before. So, the question changed from, where did the boys go, to, what was happening in the months leading up to that night? If the family was falling apart, what was going on that no one really saw? When John Skelton woke up in the hospital, the case changed from a missing persons case to a search for answers. Investigators now had the last person known to be with the boys. They needed a timeline of events, but instead, they got a story that raised more questions than answers. According to the investigation file, John Skelton said the boys were no longer with him because he had given them away. He claimed he had given Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner to a woman named Joanne Taylor, who he said was part of a secret group that protects children. He insisted the boys were safe and being taken care of, but he couldn't give any real details, like an address, phone number, or witness. The only clear thing was that he admitted he didn't have the children anymore. The troubling part was that there was no proof that anyone else did either. The mood in the interview room quickly turned serious. This wasn't just a late return or a misunderstanding. It was a story that made it seem like the children were hidden in a secret system that investigators couldn't find. Reports say Skelton suggested this group was connected to Amish communities and operated in secret. He said he was protecting the boys from a dangerous situation, but his beliefs weren't proven. Investigators needed real evidence. They started by trying to find Joanne Taylor. They contacted law enforcement in different states, searched databases, and investigated leads in Amish communities and other groups that matched Skelton's description. However, they found no real evidence that this person existed. The name appeared in records, but none matched Skelton's story. Every attempt to confirm his story failed. This was a turning point in the case. Before this, there were different possible explanations. Now, investigators were faced with a story that couldn't be proven. This lack of proof didn't reveal what happened to the boys, but it narrowed down the possibilities. If the children weren't with this secret group, then they weren't safe at all. This was devastating for Tanya Zuvers, who now had a mix of hope and fear, believing her sons might be alive but unreachable. For the investigators, the situation became more serious. They stopped treating the story as a lead and started trying to prove it wrong. In every investigation, there comes a time when words and reality separate. This was that time. The father had given an explanation, but the more they looked into it, the less sense it made. If the story about Joanne Taylor wasn't true, what was John Skelton trying to hide? As the story became less believable, investigators focused on concrete evidence like movement. Cars and phones leave records, and time creates patterns. These patterns started to contradict John Skelton's story. The investigation revealed that Skelton's vehicle had traveled outside of Michigan before he allegedly attempted to harm himself. Data placed him in rural Ohio, where it's hard to see and there's little surveillance. This raised important questions. If he handed the boys off to someone, where did it happen? Why did he cross state lines without meeting anyone verifiable? Phone records added another layer. Investigators analyzed calls, texts, and cell tower data. They didn't find evidence of contact with another person, but a pattern that led back to Skelton himself. There were no confirmed communications with anyone like Joanne Taylor, no calls to arrange a transfer, and no messages confirming a meeting. This digital silence contradicted his physical movements. He drove somewhere, but there was no proof that he met anyone. Search teams followed his route into Ohio, searching fields, woods, and abandoned properties, places where something could be hidden. The searches were methodical but emotionally draining. Each location held the possibility of finding something, and the fear of what that discovery might reveal. However, they found nothing conclusive, no trace of the three boys, and no physical evidence to draw any conclusions. Investigators also searched Skelton's home. Forensic teams carefully examined the house for signs of a struggle, concealment, or removal. Reports stated there was no immediate evidence of violence inside. This complicated the story, suggesting that either nothing happened, or it left a minimal trace, or it happened elsewhere. Then, Skelton's timeline began to show inconsistencies, small gaps, unexplained delays, and moments where his actions didn't match the data. Each inconsistency alone wasn't proof of guilt, but together they formed a pattern, unexplained movement and unaccounted for time. The investigation was no longer just about one claim, but about reconstructing a sequence of events, where he went, when he stopped, and what he did during the hours when no one could see him. This reconstruction revealed that every verified detail pointed back to Skelton. The roads had been mapped, the signals traced, and the story tested. But the most important question still remained. If Skelton didn't hand them off, what did happen during the hours when he was alone with his sons? When the evidence ran out, the search stretched into silence. After Thanksgiving 2010, the disappearance of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton became more than just an investigation. It became a widespread and unresolved absence. Law enforcement agencies expanded the search across state lines. Tips and sightings were reported, offering brief moments of hope that almost always faded. After November 25th, there was no proof that the boys were alive. No one saw them, no one heard from them, and no evidence indicated they were still alive. Investigators considered this absence one of the most defining elements of the case. In missing child investigations, time usually reveals something, like a witness, a camera, or a mistake. But in this case, time only created more distance. Search teams repeatedly returned to rural land, waterways, and isolated structures connected to Skelton's route in Ohio. Each search was deliberate, documented, and ultimately unsuccessful. The emotional burden of these operations grew heavier with each passing season. Volunteers joined, communities organized efforts, and flyers were distributed. The boys' faces became known far beyond Morenci, but familiarity didn't lead to discovery. Meanwhile, investigators kept pressing Skelton for information. They interviewed him and reviewed his statements, but he stuck to his story. He claimed the boys were alive and safe. However, he refused to give any verifiable details, even as years went by. This refusal itself became a kind of evidence, showing he was withholding information about what happened. Tanya Zuvers experienced the search in two different ways. Publicly, the search was active, with ongoing efforts. But privately, it was stuck in uncertainty. Because there was no proof that the boys were dead, there was still hope. But without proof that they were alive, there was no peace. Families of missing children often describe this as a prolonged state of waiting, not quite grief and not quite closure. As time passed, the investigation continued but changed. Leads became less frequent, attention decreased, and resources dwindled. The case entered a cold phase, as investigators sometimes call it, though it didn't feel cold to those still affected. Underlying everything was one remaining question: if no trace of the three boys had been found after so many years, was it because they were hidden, or because they were never meant to be found? In 2011, the case had its first legal resolution, but not its end. Almost a year after the disappearance, John Skelton pleaded no contest to 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. This charge didn't require proof of murder. It only required proof that he intentionally deprived his children of their freedom without legal authority. The court accepted his plea and sentenced him to 10 to 15 years in prison. This was the first legal acknowledgement that a crime had been committed. However, the most important thing remained: the boys were still missing. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. This wasn't a trial with a complete story. There were no bodies, no confirmed cause of death, and no clear picture of what happened after Thanksgiving. Instead, the court focused on a more limited truth that could be proven: Skelton had taken his children and not returned them. He had removed them from the world, and no one could undo it. For prosecutors, the plea ensured accountability, given the available evidence. It avoided the risk of a trial where the lack of physical evidence might make a conviction difficult. For the defense, it avoided a potentially harsher sentence. But for the family and investigators, the result created a different kind of emptiness. The legal process had moved forward, but the mystery hadn't been solved. According to statements at the time, Skelton continued to claim that the boys were alive. He didn't provide any new, verifiable information, such as locations or names. He offered no way to resolve the case. His silence, selective and controlled, became a key part of the case. It wasn't the silence of not knowing, but the silence of refusing to speak. Cases like this highlight a limitation of the justice system. It can determine responsibility and impose punishment, but it can't always find the truth. A conviction can happen even when uncertainty remains, and a sentence can be served while questions go unanswered. As the years went by, this contradiction became clearer. John Skelton was in prison, but the boys were still missing. Time passed, but the case didn't close. And with each year, another question arose, going beyond guilt or innocence. If someone is punished for taking children but never says where they are, what does justice really mean? In missing persons cases, time doesn't necessarily reveal the truth, it changes it. In 2025, it had been almost 15 years since Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton disappeared. There had been no confirmed sightings or physical evidence during that time, and hope was dwindling. In 2025, the case took a significant turn, not because of new evidence but due to a legal decision. A Michigan court declared the three boys legally dead. This declaration was a procedural step, but it had a profound emotional impact. It didn't explain how the boys died, where they died, or who was responsible. It simply acknowledged that their disappearance was no longer temporary. The court reasoned that the prolonged absence of any sign of life, combined with the circumstances of their disappearance, met the requirements for a death declaration. It was a formal recognition of their loss, even without finding their remains. The atmosphere in the courtroom was somber. For Tanya Zuvers, this moment brought a different kind of finality. For years, she had held on to the hope that her sons might still be alive. The declaration didn't erase that hope, but it forced a shift. Officially, the case moved from a missing persons case to a presumed death case. However, the court didn't declare that John Skelton had murdered his children. This distinction was important. There was no direct physical evidence linking him to a specific act of killing. The law could acknowledge the boys were gone, but it couldn't yet determine how they died. For investigators, the declaration closed one chapter and opened another. The case was now considered a likely homicide without a confirmed crime scene. This changed how evidence was interpreted, what charges could be filed, and what justice might look like. Adding to the urgency, John Skelton's prison sentence was nearing its end. He was expected to be released in 2025 after more than a decade. The fact that the man legally responsible for the disappearance of his children could soon be free while the case remained unresolved put pressure on investigators. The convergence of the legal death declaration, the unresolved truth, and Skelton's impending release forced investigators to act. Could the system finally prove who was responsible for the boys' deaths now that they were legally recognized as dead? In late 2025, as John Skelton approached the end of his prison sentence, the case moved forward with renewed momentum. Prosecutors filed new charges, 3 counts of murder, along with evidence tampering. The timing was deliberate, coming just weeks before his expected release. The message was clear: the case was not over. This marked a decisive shift. For the first time, the legal system was asserting that Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner were not just missing but that they had been killed. Authorities believed that the years of silence, the lack of proof of life, the inconsistencies in Skelton's statements, and the absence of any other explanation had reached a tipping point. The case had moved from uncertainty to accusation. The announcement was made in a controlled but tense atmosphere. There was still no breakthrough in terms of traditional evidence. There were no bodies, no confirmed location, and no direct physical evidence of the cause of death. Instead, prosecutors relied on a collection of circumstantial evidence that had been gathered, reinforced, and interpreted over time. They believed it was enough to bring the case to trial on the most serious charges. For Tanya Zuvers, this moment was complicated. It didn't bring closure or resolution, but it was progress after years of waiting. The possibility of a murder conviction offered something that had been missing, a formal acknowledgement of what she had come to believe, that her sons were not hidden somewhere, but that they had been taken from her permanently. For John Skelton, the charges reopened a legal battle he had never fully escaped. He had always maintained that the boys were alive, a claim that now directly contradicted the state's position. The courtroom became the arena where two opposing stories finally clashed, one based on claims, the other on evidence. However, throughout the case, one stark fact remained: the boys were still missing. The case's lasting impact lies not in resolution, but in what's missing. Justice here isn't a clear-cut result, but a limited process. A guilty verdict might identify the responsible party, but it might never reveal the boys' location or their final moments. Some cases conclude with a discovery, others with a confession. This case, however, remains suspended between proof and unanswered questions. 3 boys disappeared after Thanksgiving. Years passed. Laws changed. Charges shifted. Yet, the most fundamental question persists: where are Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton? And if that question remains unanswered, what essential part of the truth will forever be lost? The storm had already taken the power. Wind pressed against the small home in Shelby, North Carolina, rattling its quiet certainty. Inside, sometime after midnight on February 14, 2000, 9-year-old Asha Degree lay in bed she shared with her older brother. By all accounts, it was an ordinary night. No signs of distress. No disruption that could explain what would follow. At approximately 2:30 a.m., according to later statements, Asha got out of bed. There was no forced entry. No evidence of struggle. According to the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, the front door was quietly opened. Asha stepped outside into the dark, into cold rain. Investigators would later confirm she took a small backpack. Inside were personal belongings and clothes. Packed deliberately. Hours passed before the absence was discovered. Around 6:30 a.m., her mother, Aquila Degree, went to wake the children for school. Asha was gone. Within minutes, panic replaced confusion. Family members searched the immediate area. Then, a 911 call. The case moved from private fear to public emergency. But even before the call, something else had already begun to unfold on Highway 18. According to later witness statements given to investigators and reported by outlets, such as Summaries, at least 2 motorists reported seeing a young girl walking along the roadside between approximately 3:45 and 4:15 a.m. She was alone. Wearing light-colored clothing. Carrying something. One driver, concerned, turned his vehicle around. As he approached, the girl ran off the road and into the darkness, disappearing into nearby woods. It would later be believed, though not officially confirmed in absolute terms, that this was Asha, a 9-year-old. Walking into the storm. Fleeing from the only adult who stopped to help. By sunrise, search teams would begin retracing that same stretch of highway. But the first and most haunting question had already taken shape: why did she leave at all? And more urgently, what was waiting for her out there? There was nothing in Asha's life that suggested she would leave. According to family members and investigative records referenced by the FBI and multiple media outlets, Asha was raised in a structured, attentive household in Shelby, North Carolina. Her parents, Harold and Aquila Degree, maintained routines that emphasized discipline, school, and church. The children had a set bedtime. There were rules about phone use, television, and staying inside. It was, by all outward appearances, a stable environment. Asha was described as shy, quiet, cautious. She was afraid of the dark. She was afraid of dogs. These details were consistently repeated by family and confirmed in early reports. They would later become critical contradictions in the case. Because on the night she disappeared, Asha walked alone into darkness, into a storm, along the highway. That behavior did not align with the child everyone knew. At school, she was a fourth-grade student with no known behavioral issues. Teachers reportedly described her as well-mannered and responsible. She had friends. She played basketball. Just days before her disappearance, she had participated in a game where she fouled out and was visibly upset, but according to her family, she recovered quickly. There were no lingering signs of distress. There was no history of running away. No known exposure to strangers online. In 2000, internet access for children in that household was limited, if present at all, according to statements from investigators. No evidence has publicly confirmed grooming or external communication leading up to that night. Her routine on February 13th, the day before she vanished, followed a familiar pattern. Church, family time, school preparation. At some point that evening, there had been a brief power outage due to a storm. The family spent time together before going to bed. Nothing unusual was reported. No arguments. No disciplinary incidents. No emotional triggers that could clearly explain a decision to leave home in the middle of the night. And yet, sometime after 2:30 a.m., Asha packed a bag and walked out. Investigators would later consider the possibility that she left voluntarily, but under the influence, either internal or external. According to law enforcement statements over the years, the theory that she was meeting someone has never been ruled out, though it remains unproven. Because what troubled investigators most was not just that she left, it was how prepared she seemed to be. She took specific items. Clothing. Personal belongings. Packed with intention. Not the impulsive act of a frightened child. But not entirely the plan of an adult either. The road was nearly empty. Highway 18 stretched through rural Cleveland County like a dark corridor, bordered by trees and open land. In the early hours of February 14, 2000, the storm had not yet passed. Rain fell steadily. Visibility was low. The kind of night where drivers slowed down, focused only on what their headlights could hold. According to investigative reports later cited by the FBI and regional media, the first sighting came sometime between 3:45 and 4 a.m. A motorist traveling along Highway 18 noticed a small figure walking along the roadside. At first, it did not register as unusual. But as the vehicle drew closer, the shape became clearer. It was a child. A young girl, walking alone, wearing what appeared to be light-colored clothing. She carried something, possibly a bag. The driver continued on. Moments later, uncertainty set in. The image did not align with the hour, the weather, or the place. The motorist turned around. When the vehicle approached again, the girl reacted. She ran. She left the roadside and moved quickly into the darkness, disappearing into a wooded area nearby. The driver, unsettled, did not pursue further. A second witness would later report a similar encounter. Another motorist, traveling along the same stretch of highway within the same time window, observed a young girl walking southbound. This driver would also later come forward after hearing news of Asha's disappearance. Law enforcement treated them as credible. The timing aligned. The location matched the direction away from Asha's home. According to the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, these sightings became a central pillar in reconstructing her last known movements. But they raised deeper questions. Why was she walking along that specific route? Why did she avoid help? And more critically, was she alone? At that stage of the investigation, there was no confirmed evidence of a vehicle picking her up. No direct witness to an abduction. No physical sign of struggle along the roadside. Only a pattern. A child moving with purpose, then vanishing into the trees. Search teams would later comb that exact area. Dogs were brought in. Officers walked the terrain where she had been seen leaving the road. But the woods gave nothing back. No footprints that could be definitively tracked. No immediate evidence of where she went next. By daylight, the road had changed. What had been an empty stretch of highway hours earlier was now crowded with patrol cars, volunteers, and search teams moving with urgency. The call had come in shortly after 6:30 a.m. A 9-year-old girl was missing. Last seen in her own home. No signs of forced entry. No explanation. No broken locks. No signs of entry. No forensic indicators of a struggle inside the house. According to early investigative findings, this strongly suggested that Asha had left on her own. Within hours, the case escalated. According to the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office and later FBI summaries, deputies began canvassing the area immediately surrounding the Degree home. Family members, neighbors, and volunteers joined the search. The focus at first was simple: assume proximity, assume she had not gone far. But then the witness reports came in. Drivers had seen a young girl walking along Highway 18 hours earlier. The direction matched. The timeline held. The search shifted. By mid-morning, law enforcement redirected resources toward the highway corridor. Ground teams began retracing the exact stretch where the sightings had occurred. Tracking dogs were deployed. Helicopters surveyed from above. Officers moved through wooded areas on foot, scanning for any disturbance, footprints, discarded items, or signs of struggle. But the terrain was difficult. Wet ground from the storm had compromised potential tracks. According to investigators, scent tracking dogs were used but struggled to maintain a consistent trail, possibly due to weather conditions and the passage of time. Attention, as is standard in missing child cases, briefly turned toward the immediate circle. Family members were interviewed. Timelines were checked. According to law enforcement statements, no evidence publicly emerged to implicate the parents or close relatives. Their accounts were consistent with the physical findings inside the home. Then, as search teams expanded beyond the highway and into nearby properties, something began to surface, small, almost insignificant at first. The first real break did not come from the highway. It came from a place no one expected: a tool shed. Several days into the search, as investigators expanded their radius beyond Highway 18, attention turned to a property along the same route where Asha had reportedly been seen. The location belonged to a local business, situated near the roadside, where one of the motorists had described seeing the young girl leave the pavement and run into the darkness. According to investigative reports later referenced by the FBI and regional media, search teams began examining outbuildings in the area. One of them, a small storage shed, stood slightly apart. Inside, the air was still, undisturbed at first glance. But as investigators looked closer, something felt out of place. Items had been moved, not significantly, not violently, but enough to suggest recent presence. Then came the details. Candy wrappers, a pencil, a hair bow. According to law enforcement statements, these items were later identified as consistent with belongings Asha had been carrying or wearing before her disappearance. The hair bow, in particular, was believed to match those owned by her, though some details have not been publicly confirmed with absolute certainty. What mattered was the implication. Asha had likely made it to this shed. She had left the road. She had entered a confined space. Possibly to hide. Possibly to rest. possibly because she was afraid. She took shelter. But for how long? And what happened next? The shed did not provide signs of struggle. No confirmed blood evidence. No clear indication of forced removal. Just traces of presence, followed by absence. It became the last location where investigators could reasonably place her with any degree of physical certainty. After that point, the case fractured again. No footprints leading away that could be reliably tracked. No witnesses beyond the road. No confirmed timeline beyond the early morning hours. For over a year, the case stood still. No confirmed sightings. No suspect. No clear direction. The trail that had once stretched from a quiet home to a dark highway, then into a roadside shed, had dissolved into absence. Investigators continued to pursue leads, but none produced a definitive breakthrough. Then, in August 2001, more than 18 months after Asha Degree vanished, the case shifted again. This time, the evidence did not emerge near Highway 18. It surfaced miles away. According to the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office and widely reported, construction workers along Highway 18 North, near Morganton, uncovered something unusual while excavating land for a new development. Inside a black trash bag, double-wrapped, was a backpack. It had been hidden beneath the soil. When authorities were notified and the contents examined, the connection became immediate. The backpack was identified as belonging to Asha Degree. The distance was significant, approximately 26 miles from her home. Inside the backpack, investigators found personal items believed to have been packed by Asha the night she left. Clothing. Objects tied to her identity. Among the reported contents, though not all officially confirmed in full detail, was also a New Kids on the Block t-shirt and a book not linked to her household, suggesting possible external contact or influence. The condition of the bag raised further concern. According to investigators, this indicated awareness, an attempt to hide evidence rather than abandon it. The discovery reframed the entire case. Until that point, the possibility of voluntary movement, however unlikely, remained part of the discussion. But a buried backpack, wrapped and transported miles away, pointed strongly toward third-party involvement. An abduction. Or at minimum, post-disappearance interference. The timeline, however, remained fractured. There was still no confirmed moment of contact. No witness to a vehicle. No forensic link publicly tying the backpack to a specific individual. The case had changed. After the discovery of the buried backpack, investigators no longer treated Asha Degree's disappearance as a mystery of intent, but as a probable crime involving another person. The focus shifted from why she left to who she encountered after she did. And yet, even with that shift, the path forward remained uncertain. According to statements from the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office and later FBI involvement, hundreds of leads were processed in the months and years following the discovery. Tips came from across the state, and eventually, across the country. Some were based on memory. Others are on speculation. Many led nowhere. But a few stood out. One of the most discussed leads involved a vehicle. In 2016, after years of re-examining the case, the FBI and local authorities publicly announced renewed interest in a specific type of car, described as a dark green, early 1970s Lincoln Continental Mark IV, or a similar model. According to the investigation, witnesses had possibly seen a vehicle matching that description near the area where Asha was last observed along Highway 18. The detail was not new, but the emphasis was. Authorities believed the vehicle could be connected to her disappearance. However, no suspect was publicly identified in connection with that vehicle. No arrest followed. The lead, like many others, expanded the possibilities without narrowing them. Investigators also revisited the timeline repeatedly. They analyzed the gap between the shed and the buried backpack. They re-interviewed witnesses. They examined whether Asha had been lured, possibly by someone she trusted, or someone who had observed her routine. According to official statements, the theory that she was meeting someone has remained under consideration, though never confirmed. There was no verified evidence of communication. No letters. No phone records indicating contact. Despite the scale of the investigation, no forensic evidence has been publicly disclosed linking any individual to Asha's disappearance. No DNA match. No confession. No direct witness to an abduction. The case moved forward in fragments. Each new lead raised hope, then collapsed under scrutiny. Each theory offered structure, then dissolved under a lack of proof. And over time, the investigation entered a different phase. Not closed, but suspended between knowledge and absence. Because even after years of work, one fact remained unchanged: there was still no definitive answer to what happened after Asha left that shed. And without that moment, the truth remained just out of reach. Years passed, but the case of Asha Degree never moved into the past. It remained active, revisited, reanalyzed, and, at times, quietly reawakened. According to the FBI and the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, the investigation has never been closed. It exists in a state of persistence, waiting for something, one detail, one memory, one mistake, to shift the balance. Asha would have grown up. That fact became part of the public narrative. Age-progressed images were released over the years, showing what she might look like as a teenager, then as an adult. These were not just visual tools, they were reminders. That somewhere, theoretically, a life could still exist beyond the point where all evidence had ended. But investigators have been careful. While hope remains part of the case, the evidence tells a more complicated story. The buried backpack. The distance. The concealment. These are not elements typically associated with a safe outcome. According to law enforcement statements, the working assumption has long leaned toward foul play, though no official declaration of death has been made due to the absence of a body. And that absence matters. Without it, certain legal thresholds cannot be crossed. Certain conclusions cannot be formally declared. The case remains suspended, not solved, not forgotten. In recent years, authorities have renewed calls for information. Advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA analysis, have offered new avenues. Cold cases once thought unsolvable have been reopened through technology. Asha's case is among those that could still change, but technology alone cannot solve everything. For Asha's family, time has not dulled the question. What happened after she left the shed? Who crossed her path? And why has that moment remained hidden for so long? The case of Asha Degree is not defined by what is known. It is defined by what is missing. A child leaves home in the night. She is seen walking alone. She hides. Then, she vanishes. And somewhere between those points, the truth still waits.